Okay. Looks like I have this open in two windows, so give me 1 second. Also, can everybody hear me? I am always goofing up things on here, even though it's been several months, I still goof things up. All right, there we go. We are all set. All right, welcome everybody. For those of you who have been watching the streams for the past few months, or whether you're new or whatever, I should say that I just started a Discord server, so you are welcome to join that. If you're coming over here from Discord, then welcome to the YouTube channel, and hopefully the two can just, synergize, and I can get people from the YouTube channel over to Discord and people from Discord over to the channel, so that we can, keep the party going, I guess. So, let me just give a little brief intro. So this is Lance Independent. For those of you, because I probably mentioned this a few times, if you're wondering what is up with the name, so the name is a play on the term stance independent, which is a term that's used to characterize the view that I talk about the most on this channel. I'm sure people are, hopefully not tired of hearing it, but very used to hearing it. Moral realism. So moral realism is this view that there are facts about what's morally right or wrong or good or bad that's true independent of your goals, standards, or values. Now, I am very critical of that view. And I think that the perception, at least within the philosophical community and sort of adjacent communities in general, might be that if you have this kind of view that you're sort of like anti-morality, you don't think ethics is real and all that sort of stuff. And that is not at all the view. So moral anti-realism is the view that there are no stance independent facts. And so stance independent, my name is Lance, so Lance independent, it rhymes. There's something that just, clicked when someone recommended that to me. So I went with that name and I've been happy with it. So Lance independent. So anyway, so anti-realism, that's the view that I probably do the most work on this channel talking about. However, my interests have been shifting more towards meta-philosophy. So if you are not, and some people have criticized the term meta-philosophy, you could also call it philosophy of philosophy. But basically you could call it a sort of branch of philosophy or area of inquiry that explores the fundamental nature of philosophy itself. What is philosophy? How does it work? What are its aims? What are its methods? What sort of criticisms can we have of those methods? How can we improve it? Does philosophy make progress? What are the different, how should we conceptualize the contents of philosophy? What distinguishes philosophy from non-philosophy? You can see there are many, many questions in this area. Now, one thing that you might find quite surprising, or at least this is my impression from at least some background in studying philosophy, is that you would think of all the disciplines that if there were a discipline that we're going to spend a lot of time doing this kind of meta work, talking about what is the discipline itself about, it would be philosophy. And you would be, at least from my point of view, mistaken. There is a lot less meta philosophy discussed and, that goes on in the field of philosophy than one might have expected, which I find very strange. And I am growing increasingly suspicious about that, because part of my concern with the current state of analytic philosophy, that is a sort of a recent extension of Western philosophy that is dominant in the Anglophone world, so primarily the United States, the UK, New Zealand, Australia, Canada. It's all over the world, but it's predominantly in those regions. I'm concerned that the lack of interest and, to my point of view, curiosity about how philosophy works, it's kind of like, don't look and you don't have to deal with the problem. But I think that there are big problems there. I'm not the first person to say this. There are many people that have been critical of the field for quite a long time. And the field has always sort of just continued onward in spite of the slings and arrows that have, people have heralded the death of philosophy for forever. And it just continues on. So, I won't be the first. I probably won't be the last to be critical of the field, and it continues. Although, I think that times can change, and just because people have said that in the past doesn't mean there isn't something to it now. But in any case, so my name is Lance. This is my channel. I talk about meta ethics, which is about, it's a branch of philosophy that deals with abstract questions about the nature of morality. I deal with meta philosophy, just, all the stuff that I've already talked about. I sometimes deal with moral psychology. That will increase as I, continue on. When I get started, I do this every week. I like to just sort of say whatever comes to mind for a few minutes, do a few introductions. I still feel like my channel's very new. I guess I just see people that have had channels for years and years, and I still feel new, even though I started, I think, back in January. So I've been at this we're going on 6 months now, and I still feel like I just started. I'm goofy. I'm not good with I'm always messing up the microphone or the camera or something like that. So today, it might seem like almost like I'm starting my channel. And today is a big day for me. So I will make one announcement, which is that I have officially completed my PhD. I had finished the dissertation and all that stuff some time ago, but there's timing with when conferral dates happen and all that sort of stuff. And so I finally obtained my degree last week. So I'm officially Dr. Bush. Please don't call me that. Just call me Lance, or you could call me Lance Independent if you want. I don't know how much people like calling it. Whatever. It's up to me what I want to be called. So Lance Independent, whatever. I don't really care that much. But so I officially got that. So that degree was from Cornell. It was in social psychology. I think the area is technically called social and personality, although as far as I know, most of the people there are focused primarily on social psych. And that's the area that I did my PhD in. So PhD from Cornell, just finished that. Really, things were done a while ago, but I just had to wait for the degree. And then prior to that, I did a master's at Tufts University, a terminal master's. So meaning it's not like part of the PhD program. It's just you get a master's and you're done. And so Tufts has this fantastic master's program in philosophy. And I went there and I did that. For anybody that's familiar with I don't know, just the Tufts program, it's a pretty well-known program as far as I know. But that was really cool. That's where I really started getting into meta ethics. And while I was there, I was a research assistant in a moral psych lab. And so I do this interdisciplinary work in moral psychology, although I haven't talked about that much on the channel. I am planning to, so now that sort of line is crossed and the degree is behind me, I had really had only like one half of my efforts invested in this, and things now are going to start to change. So I've already, I had held off on scheduling too many like attempts at interviews or debates or discussions or anything like that. Now that this is behind me and I've got the summer coming up and I've got the time and the energy and the motivation and things have been put behind me, now it's time to start a bunch of new things. So I'm going to be bringing guests on the channel. I'm going to start doing probably live streams at different points of the week. And when I do that, I'm a lot more interested now in bringing people on to discuss things. I should say, when I do that, I'm going to have a few expectations about people that come on the channel. So I use StreamYard for this, and I will be posting a link to StreamYard in here. So, be aware of that's the software that I'm going to be using. When you want to come on the channel to talk to me about things, this is not a channel for people to scream and yell and fight with each other. If I bring 2 or more people on there and start fighting, I'm going to have to say, hey, cool it. It's not a place for people to be nasty and disrespectful and rude. I want to have, straightforward, calm conversations. This is not like the octagon and people are going to duke it out here. It's just not going to happen. I'm not going to allow it, and I'm not going to fight with people that come on here. I'm also not going to tolerate any silliness or nonsense. If people want to do weird stuff, if they come on the channel. So just be on your best behavior. I will probably ask you to do something to indicate like who you are. I may have people, put their camera on. If you're not comfortable doing that, we could figure something out. I understand if some people don't want to appear on camera. I'd really like to have guests on here. It's just I've had experience with other people streaming and things getting chaotic very quickly, and I don't even want to start that. So I am going to focus on keeping things, civil here. All right, so let me start saying hi to everybody. I saw Jonathan from a while ago. I accidentally put this for a few hours before, so I had to fix it. So, hey, I hope you're here again. I know there's often schedule issues. So hopefully now that I'm going to be streaming a bit more, you'll have more of a chance to see me at other times. Okay, thank you. Glad you could hear me. If I was talking this whole time and nobody could hear me, that would have been a serious problem. Hello. Thanks. Yeah, it's about time. All right, we already got a comment, so let's get to that. Since the inauguration of modern philosophy, most famously, I really should read these before I put them up here because I could get halfway through and then it just says something terrible. All right, let me slow it down. I really got to. I get so energized when I'm here that I can talk super fast. It could be a problem. All right, let's calm it down. Since the inauguration of modern philosophy, most famously exemplified by Hume or Kant, we have had a critique of methodology continuous within modern methods in analytic philosophy. That's true. I agree that there's been a persistent critique of method. Unfortunately, it feels like most mainstream analytic philosophers are like, yeah, the table for the critiques is over there. And so it's allowed. They're not drummed out of universities and told they're not allowed to be around. I mean, Wittgenstein is one of the most renowned philosophers of the 20th century and was famously, pretty anti-philosophical in certain respects. So there has been this continuous critique. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like it's gotten enough traction in terms of entrenching itself in large, influential, mainstream approaches, at least within the area where I tend to work, which is metaethics. So, and even if it has, that seems to have fallen by the wayside in the past few decades. There has been a sort of modern resurgence in a more, I prefer to frame it as like a Morean approach. Non-naturalist moral realism, is pretty popular these days. My impression is that it wasn't around, 1950. And I see that personally as a regress in the field. Of course, anyone that's a proponent of that view would have seen the dip in realism around that time as a regress. So different people have different points of view on the matter. But yeah, there's been a critique. It just hasn't really entrenched itself. If you want to get a sense of that, I mean, it's hard to tell from the PhilPapers data. The PhilPapers data, I would say, is very low resolution. Oh, if you're not familiar. So PhilPapers is this website. They have a bunch of connected things: PhilJobs, PhilEvents, PhilPeople, and PhilPapers. And PhilPapers did a survey back in 2020. And basically, it's a site for networking and uploading and archiving articles in philosophy and I guess related fields. So they did a big survey of philosophers. They did one back in 2009 and one in 2020. In 2009, I think you had 56.4%. I don't need the decimal points, but about 56% of people were proponents of moral realism, and that shot up to 62%, just a little bit, but still a steady increase. Since 2009, it shot up to 62% moral realists among the respondents. The 2020 survey had 1,750 respondents. I don't remember how many responded to the question about moral realism. But if you look at the specialists in metaethics, which I think was 228 of the respondents, which I believe is about 13% of the people that responded to the survey, 228 out of them, it was about 65% were proponents of moral realism. So if you look at specialists, it's almost the same and increases a slight bit towards realism. But it's hard to get a general sense of the critique of like how popular views that are critical of mainstream analytic methods actually are in the field. My general impression is that they're not super duper popular. So I was interested in this book, Philosophy Without Intuitions, back about 10 years ago when I was at Tufts. I remember that the reception towards it was not particularly positive. So it wasn't well received. Now, I didn't necessarily endorse the contents of the arguments in the book, but I thought that they were worth looking at. It was interesting to have someone arguing that, not that philosophers shouldn't use intuitions, but that generally speaking, at least historically, they don't appeal to intuitions as evidence, and that the contemporary characterization and presumption, there are problems with that characterization. So I thought that was an interesting perspective, and at least where I was, that wasn't well received. Anyway, so hey, Rebecca, how's it going? Glad to have you here. At some point we're going to have to celebrate. I know it's been a long road with me finishing things up. I've just been super busy getting to this point. So sorry about that, but hello, and I'm glad to have you here. All right. Oh, I see. That continued. We, however, seem to be in another dark age. Forgive my mediocre sweeping history. Yeah, I'm not a historian of philosophy, so everything that I'm saying could be a very parochial and narrow in perspective, distinctive to the kinds of research I've done and the areas I've looked at, which is this tiny slice of psychology and a tiny slice of philosophy. And if your perspective is very different from that, and you think that my perspective is skewed or just false, or at least needs to be tempered or qualified, please let me know. You could do that in the chat. You could email me, get in touch, however you want to contact me. I should say, I also have a blog called Lance Independent, so check that out. I started that before the channel, and that's where a lot of the action goes on. I know a lot of people these days are probably, more busy with channels and that sort of thing, but I like blogging. I enjoy it, and a lot of my writing is over there. I'm also working on getting portions of the dissertation published, and I've got a few papers in the works. So hopefully now that the dissertation is out of the way, I'll start getting more publications. So that should be fun. All right. I see some promotion for my channel. While watching and only 4 likes. Let's see if we got the number up. I only see 6 likes. Let's get it up. All right. So I should get to what I'm talking about today. Also, if you saw the thumbnail, that is my puppy. Her name is Pitanga. So she's super cute. I'll have to bring her in here sometime so everybody could see her. But she's the best. And if you're in here right now, she'd be jumping at me and trying to steal the show, which she probably would. But yeah, so the topic today, we can believe the error theory. I'll get into that in a moment. I just want to see if anybody else wants to say hi or wants to jump in here. And I'm going to pop over to Discord real quick and make sure that people are seeing that announcement. Let's see. Yeah, so, maybe I could put a link to the Discord in here so everybody here can join over to that if they want to. Let me do that. Give me 1 second. Let's do that. I see a few people here, but not too many comments just yet. All right. So I have pinned the Discord. You are welcome to join that. And we already have quite a few members there, so feel free to join. And there'll be a lot of more focused discussion. It's less intended to be a casual server. This was just created yesterday, and more intended for more serious discussion about the various topics of interest on this channel. So there'll be metaethics, metaphilosophy, moral psychology, there's philosophy more generally. If you're into other stuff, that would be totally fine. There's voice channels. You could get in there and have discussions, debates. If you just want to write stuff, you could do that. So however you want to do things. It's also a place that's going to be an easy way to get in touch with me if you want. So you could add me on there. I'm easy to find in that server. Also Lance Independent in there. So just get in touch that way. It's going to be a good way. I like the interface there. So I think I'm going to start using it more. Okay, so what I wanted to talk about today is some work by Bart Strumer. So Strumer wrote this book, I believe it's called Unbelievable Errors. Although maybe I can't believe that since I don't think there's any reason for having beliefs. So let me double check. Unbelievable Errors. It is, yeah. Let me throw a link into there. Let me throw a link to that into the chat. Let's drop that in there. And Strumer also has a paper on this and has done a few talks and interviews. And I've had a little bit of interaction with Strumer. And so Strumer is an error theorist, a moral anti-realist like myself. And I find a lot to like in the anti-realist and error theoretic perspectives more generally. Oh, I should note on that. It's frequently called the error theory, and I hate the that's added to it. So I call it error theory. Too bad if people are going, why aren't you calling it the error theory? I call it error theory. I'm not calling it the error theory. It reminds me of the Batman. I hate that. It's Batman. It's not the Batman. So it's error theory. I insist on calling it that. I'll also add a note on that. There is a remarkable inconsistency in the terminology used in metaethics. Nobody can agree on what terms to use to refer to anything. It's very frustrating. I wish we could all have a big conference and just vote on the terms that we are going to use for different concepts and just stick with some precise set of terminology. That would be super helpful. Anyway, so this is actually a really brief one to discuss, but oh, you are here. Awesome. Cool. Welcome, Jonathan. Are you able to stick around today? What's up? So this one's really, really brief, and then I could just talk about whatever we want to talk about if anyone has questions, comments, that sort of thing. So on Strumer's view, and it's an interesting perspective, the error theory is true, but it's unbelievable. We can't believe the error theory. And I called it the error theory. We can't believe error theory. Dang. So the idea behind this is, this isn't just moral error theory. It's a global normative error theory. So it applies to all purportedly stance-independent normative facts of any kind. And that would include epistemic considerations about what we're in a position to know or be justified in believing. And so if we endorse this kind of, or if we want to entertain this kind of global error theory, I guess I should say what error theory is. So error theory is a view which holds that a certain subset of claims, and it was initially articulated for moral error theory. It was initially proposed to account for moral discourse and moral claims. And here's roughly how it works. So you take a claim like murder is wrong, a sort of prototypical moral claim. And the error theoretic account says, okay, well, first of all, let's figure out what does that mean when people say murder is wrong, or stealing is wrong, lying is wrong, or even murder is good. Someone could say that. If people make these seemingly moral assertions, first, it looks like they're stating things that are capable of being true or false. However, simply because people say murder is wrong and it's capable of being true or false, that doesn't tell us whether any of those statements are true or false. And one thing about these sorts of statements is that they can carry implicit presuppositions. And these presuppositions could themselves be systematically false. So for instance, suppose every moral claim, murder is wrong, stealing is wrong, murder is good, stealing is good, all of those claims presupposed, or were attempting to, in this particular case, presuppose the existence of these stance-independent moral facts, these moral facts that are out there. They're describing some feature of the world, some way the world is. And suppose there are no moral facts of that kind. For comparison, imagine if people went around saying things about unicorn behavior. There were unicorn ecologists or zoologists that were describing unicorn behavior. And they said unicorns love cupcakes and they hate bacon or something like that. Well, if unicorns don't exist, then unicorns like cupcakes is false. There are no unicorns, so they can't like cupcakes. But likewise, the statement unicorns hate bacon is also false. Why? Because there are no unicorns. Note that in the case of unicorns like cupcakes, the statement presupposes the existence of unicorns. And if there are no unicorns, then the statement fails to refer. It's not referring to any actual unicorns because there aren't any. And so J.L. Mackie proposed error theory in an analogous form to capture moral claims. Moral claims like murder is wrong attempt to describe some moral reality that simply doesn't exist. And so all such claims, whether they're positive or negative, murder is wrong or murder is right, murder is good or murder is bad, all of those statements are false because they contain this presupposition that there's some stance-independent moral reality that's being described by these moral assertions. And so what it does is you have that semantic component. What do the assertions mean? Oh, okay, they're attempting to refer to this reality out there. Oh, there is no such reality. So all of those claims are false. That's error theory. And Strumer argues essentially, well, I don't actually know what Strumer's argument is for how we get to a global normative error theory, but I endorse a global normative anti-realism myself. So I do think that there are no stance-independent normative facts of any kind, not just with respect to morality, but with respect to all other normative domains, including the epistemic domain. Now, I'm not going to get into the whole argument here, but essentially what Strumer argues is that there are a few conditions you need to have in order to be able to believe this. And one of them, in order to believe error theory, is that you can't believe that there are no reasons for that belief. And if you do think that, then you can't believe it. And that, I think, is a really interesting perspective. But the conclusion of this is both that error theory is true, but that you cannot believe it. Why is that? Well, if you're a global normative error theorist, if you think that there are no stance-independent normative facts of any kind, this also includes epistemic considerations, the very considerations that would give one reason to believe error theory. And so if you believe, you don't have any reasons to believe error theory, then, but also you need to have reasons to believe something, then you can't believe it. And so it looks like this type of error theory actually commits one to a set of considerations about the nature of epistemic normativity that would prohibit one from even being capable of believing the very position itself. Now, I think that's an interesting perspective. There's more that Strumer has to say about the conditions for this characterization of like the conditions necessary to have these sorts of beliefs. And I think just that there's a couple other moves that a person could make as an error theorist. And then another option would just to not be an error theorist. We could reconceptualize our view of anti-realism in a way that is similar to error theory, but doesn't carry the same implications. But the first move that one might make is to simply deny that one needs reasons for belief. So, if you have the view that you have no reasons for belief, but that, for a particular belief, but that you need reasons for a belief, then you can't believe it, right? It's necessary. I don't have it, so I can't believe it. But we could just reconsider whether we actually need reasons for belief. Now, this can look strange or counterintuitive or silly, because you might end up being committed to saying things like, I believe error theory is true, but I have no reason to believe that it's true. Now, that sounds silly, possibly. Intuitively, it violates our conception, according to some perspectives. I'm always wary of someone saying our. I don't find any problem with saying, yeah, this is true, but I have no reason to believe it. I don't have any issue with that. But some people might, and some people might take this kind of semantic intuition seriously enough to think, that can't be right. It can't be that I could believe something, but I also believe that I have no reason to believe it. That's bizarre. I can't do that. So some people might find that interesting, but you could just think, I just think you can believe things even though you have no reason for them. And then we could get into a dispute about what is meant by belief. Now, one could stipulate that by a belief, they mean something for which one must necessarily, or by definition, have a reason for, to hold that view. So you could say beliefs involve assent to the truth of a proposition for which one believes they have a reason to believe the proposition. Could be that. That you could just stipulate that's what I mean by belief. In that case, actually, I should open this up to another possibility. Then you could say I have no beliefs. Like, you could do that. You could just reject beliefs entirely. I guess that would be a concession to saying that you can't believe the error theory. And maybe that's but I don't think Sturmer would go that far. I don't know. But you could just say, I don't think that you need to have reasons for beliefs. Couldn't you assent to the truth of a proposition without thinking you have a reason to do so? And furthermore, actually thinking you don't have a reason to do so? Because Sturmer was clear to clarify for me, you don't, if you haven't even considered whether you have a reason, that wouldn't necessarily be an issue. So it's not that if you don't think you have a reason, that you can't believe it. It's that if you think you don't have a reason. So there's a difference between not thinking you do and actively thinking you don't. And it's the latter that Sturmer is concerned with, not the former. Because it's not like people can't have beliefs unless they have a conscious position on the nature of reasons. That at least doesn't seem like an issue to me. So I would agree with that, if I'm characterizing that accurately. But you could just think, I don't need reasons for beliefs. I can believe things without reasons. I mean, to me, it seemed, I don't see any issue with characterizing, like considering things true, and then also rejecting particular accounts of what reasons one might have. Can't one just find that they find something true? And if you're like, do you think you have a reason? No, I don't, but I believe it anyway. That actually doesn't seem like a problem to me, but maybe some people think it is. All right, let me get in here and see. I see a few additional comments. I'm around. You're my entertainment while making risotto. Cool. That takes a while. So I hope I could be entertaining for long enough. All right, let's see what else we got here. Could be granted, at least from my reading of highly cited literature, that ordinary language philosophy, witty critique of metaphysics disappeared, and without refutation. That's my general take on the matter. There are, let me see if I could find these real quick. 1 second. Yeah, I did find it. So Avner Boz, who was a professor at Tufts when I was there, I think he's still there, wrote this book called When Words Are Called For, A Defense of Ordinary Language Philosophy. I think I got through the first 2 chapters of that, and I was really enjoying it. I just got caught up with other stuff. I'm going to have to go back and have a read of that. But my impression from having a look at, I should say, a very, very minuscule, like not enough of a look to have any sort of deep knowledge on the matter at all. So my very shallow perspective on this is I saw some initial forays or remarks made by ordinary language philosophers, a kind of response to them, and then this kind of reaction to it. And my impression is, it doesn't look like the critiques of ordinary language philosophy, at least to me, look very compelling, because it looks to me like they kind of just presuppose the very things that ordinary language philosophers are challenging. So it doesn't look to me like this stuff has gone out of fashion as a result of compelling refutations. It looks like it went out of fashion for whatever other reasons. I mean, at least one reason is if you have this critical of a perspective towards a lot of mainstream philosophy, and people really, really like doing mainstream philosophy, they could just wait till the dust settles and go back to what they're doing and just say, shh, hopefully nobody notices. So, I've never seen any sustained effort to really cause radical change within the field. At least as far as I'm aware. It's the same thing with experimental philosophy. It sort of surged in popularity. People reacted with varying degrees of receptivity, enthusiasm, hostility, indifference, ambivalence, cautious optimism, pessimism, all sorts of reactions. But, in the past few years, it looks like experimental philosophy sort of had this surge, crashed against the walls of the ivory tower, and then it sort of just, collapsed into this tepid lake since then that is around, but it's not really, crashing down the walls of analytic philosophical methodology in the ways one might have hoped for 15 years ago. So that hasn't seemed to emerge in more recent efforts either. So who knows? I mean, there's been many, many such efforts. It looks like the fortress of mainstream analytic philosophy is pretty hard to get into. So let's see. You'll search in vain for it, as Chomsky put it in a reply to Paul. Yeah, well, yeah, I saw that exchange and it was hard to make heads or tails. I don't know if you're talking about the discussion who was it? Was it, no, what am I talking about, Chomsky? I'm thinking of an exchange between Williamson and Horwich. And that was fun, but it was hard to follow a lot of what they were talking about. I thought it was interesting though. So Horwich has this really cool book, Wittgenstein's Metaphilosophy, and that had a big influence on me. I just think I look at that and I'm like, yeah, that's kind of what I think of myself as doing in a pretty similar way. Oh, right. Let's see, it did its job too well. Scarlett would be any metaphysicians from philosophy departments. What are you referencing? I'd like to know what you're referencing when you get a chance to mention that. What is he saying when he can't believe it? Is it like saying I can't jump to the moon? It's like this. Okay, so imagine you hold the view that according to this view, there are no reasons to hold the view itself. If you think it's the case that if you think you have no reasons to believe something, that you can't believe it, and you think you do have no reason to believe it, then you can't believe it. And so it's a construal of belief according to which at least one condition for having a belief of that kind is that one can't believe they don't have a reason to believe it. And so Strumer thinks he does not have a reason to believe error theory and thus is not capable of believing it, even though it's true. So that's the perspective. Anyway, I was belaboring the point, making it too long, but so just to recap on this point of basically the response, because the title of the video is We Can Believe Error Theory. So on this view, error theory would be true. That is, it's true that there are no stance-independent moral facts and moral claims are systematically false. This view purportedly entails that we have no reasons. And this is, just to keep in mind, this is sort of generalizes from moral error theory to normative error theory more generally. Now, this view, one alleged feature of this view is that it entails that there are no reasons for believing the view itself. And insofar as one cannot believe something for which they believe they don't have reason to believe it, we would purportedly be incapable of believing error theory, this global error theory. Now, one response I've given is that you can just deny that one needs to for it not to be the case that there's going to be a lot of negations here. You can deny that it's the case that if you believe you don't have a reason to believe something, then you can't believe it. You could just think, yeah, you actually can believe something, even if you believe that you have no reason to believe it. You could think it's not a sort of condition for, like a necessary condition for believing something, that one does not believe that one has no reason to believe it. Sorry for all the negations there, but that framing is important, especially because I made a comment somewhere on YouTube, and then Strumer replied like saying, hey, hold up. You're not characterizing this accurately. It's specifically that you can't believe you don't have a reason to believe it, not that you just lack a belief that you do have a reason to believe it. Those are different. So you could just say, yeah, I don't accept that as a condition that's necessary for belief. Now, on my view, I would be more interested in offering some sort of theoretically neutral empirical operationalization of what it means to have a belief, and then just going out and seeing if people meet that condition with respect to error theory. And then we could say, yeah, people believe the error theory with respect to this, useful operationalization of belief. And in other words, I don't think that the best way to approach the conditions necessary for beliefs is this sort of a priori approach where one says these are the conditions you need to have in order to have a belief. That seems to be to impose these kind of a priori normative and descriptive constraints on the conditions necessary for belief that I don't accept them. So this, to me, a lot of this doesn't get out of the gate with me to begin with, because I just don't accept the way of characterizing belief from the outset. So, okay, so you got that first reply, that it's not, you could just say it's not the case that you could just reject that one of the conditions necessary for belief is that one cannot believe that one has no reason for a belief. You could just say, I don't accept that. You could also offer a different characterization of belief and say there's some other way, other construal of belief according to which one can believe error theory. So that'd be another move. So you could reject Sturmer's conception of conditions necessary for belief. You can offer and that would be sort of taking that account of belief, and it could be a rather substantive a priori account of belief, and then just saying I'm going to deny this one component of it. Another is to just come at it just from perpendicular and just say I have a completely different conception of belief, and that those sorts of concerns never arise, and error theory is totally believable on this construal belief. So that would be a second reply, and then a third, and this is closer to a route that I think I would be inclined to take, although it might be kind of more of a semantic or trivial distinction between those characterizations and this one, is that you can just say, hold up, there's actually a concern here. What is meant by reason? Now, I wasn't able to obtain I read Sturmer's paper that articulates this view, but I haven't read the book on believable errors. And I wasn't able to find much of a characterization of reasons. In fact, let me bring that up so I could tell you exactly what's stated in that paper. And while I do that, I'll get into the remarks. Oh, great. It was already saved, so it came right up. All right, so let's because I don't want to leave the chat too far behind. I'm already 10 minutes behind. Hey, welcome. All right. Yeah, so can you say more about that if you know more about that? So you've said that ordinary language philosophy did its job too well. And now if I go back and I put this in context, it scared all the would-be anti-metaphysicians from philosophy departments. So this is something that I talk about. And I don't know if people have seen this, but let me post this because this is something a little different and something I'm happy with, although I've gotten some pushback on this. But I started this blog series called the PhilPapers Fallacy. And this is something that I'll be talking about in a couple of weeks. So I'll put that up there, and I guess it's not as useful to put it there because you probably can't follow the link. So I will pin it. All right. So this is a blog series where I'm critiquing what I have often seen in online discussions, especially, is people saying, most philosophers think this or very few philosophers think that. And this is taken to be strong evidence of the claims in question. Now, I do think it's some evidence. I just think it's not very good evidence for the claims in question. So this, again, I had referenced earlier the 2020 PhilPapers survey, and I've seen people use it as evidence. And I've seen a few people claim that it's very strong evidence for a particular view. If most philosophers endorse that view, I don't think that it is. And I raise several reasons, why one might think that in there. And I already forgot why I was bringing this up. What was the relevance of this? Right. So if we take this remark here, scared all the would-be anti-metaphysicians from philosophy departments. Here's one concern I have about appealing to consensus or majority view, or just, the largest proportion of philosophers endorse position A over position B, C, D, E, whatever, is that one of my concerns is that there are self-selection effects with the kinds of people that go into philosophy and remain in philosophy. That is, people that are psychologically different from people outside the profession may pursue the field and persist in the field to such an extent that their views are overrepresentative relative to what one would have counterfactually were one to sort of randomly assign people to specialize in philosophy. Of course, you can't do that in practice. And the result of that is that people that, for instance, put more evidential stock in their intuitions, or that are more inclined towards metaphysical speculation, or take a less sort of, I guess you could say, hard-nosed scientific or empiricist approach, could be discouraged from going into the field or persisting in the field. Their work they might find it more difficult to get it published. They might find that their approach to things isn't well received. And they might find that with respect to many of the traditional questions of philosophy, they have very little to glom onto because they see them as futile pseudo problems. There's no practical value in asking the questions or answering the questions. They're not getting anywhere. A lot of it is a bunch of, on their view, possibly mumbo jumbo. It's a big waste of time. And so people that, for instance, think about it this way. Do you think people that are really into, I don't know, the hard sciences, biology, physics, engineering, that sort of thing, do you think they would be more or less disposed towards moral realism than, I don't know, people in more abstract theoretical fields? I guess we could, compare applied physics and theoretical physics. I think they would be more disposed towards anti-realism myself. I think that there might be a disposition or tendency, and that could be a result of either the disposition of the people that go into the field or a result of training or whatever, to have a preference for a certain philosophical approach. And that approach might be more ontologically sparse, for instance, or less metaphysically weighty. So, for instance, I would suspect that people that are more interested in biology, for instance, or neuroscience would be more inclined to deny free will and more inclined to not endorse Platonism, that sort of thing. And then people in other sorts of fields would be more inclined. I don't know. Someone could try to test that. I think there would be huge measurement problems because you're going to have people are going to interpret things differently in systematic ways between the different disciplines. And so that would be a huge problem to try to test. So I'm not optimistic about the ability to actually address the question empirically, but you could give it a try. But that could be a concern. And so, one concern is that people with dispositions like mine tend to find their views less well received in the field, and that people that are more prone towards more, I guess you could say, fancy metaphysical speculation find more traction within the field, and they could get, they could sink their teeth in a little bit deeper. And that could also create a kind of feedback effect where those people bring more people into the field who bring more people in the field. You get this kind of, the snowball going where the field continues to attract people with particular types of dispositions. Of course, this is all very speculative. I don't know if this is true, but it's certainly a possibility. All right, let's see. Awesome, welcome. Glad to have you here. Let's see. All right. I don't know why do realists and Bart Sturmer talk about reasons as opposed to motivation and believe error theory, which is obviously present for those of us truth seekers if we find it plausible. Yeah, this is something that I have addressed before and that I'll continue to address on this channel. Is I have a lot of concerns with the way reason is construed, which is this sort of last response option that I want to get to with what makes it possible to believe error theory. Although I don't believe error theory, I think you can. All right. Right. Welcome. I think I'm finally keeping on top of the comments as they come in. I just got to address them sufficiently. Yes. So that is, here's what's interesting about this. If you just ask people these questions, like if I went up to, in fact, I'd be interested in doing this. And I mean, for real, just walking up to people and saying, hey, do you believe that there are stance-independent normative facts that are true independent of your goal, standards, or values? Just rattle it off like that. I think a lot of people go, I have no idea what you're talking about. Do you endorse A theory or B theory of time? Or, that sort of thing. I think a lot of people might very well say, what the hell are you talking about? I don't know what? But a lot of the ways surveys are done is you'll give people multiple choice options. And so it would look like, hey, what theory of time do you endorse? And if you went up to people and said, what theory of time do you endorse? A lot of people are going to go, what do you mean theory of time? There's different theories of time? Why are you asking me this? But if you're filling out a survey, you've already agreed to do it. You've filled out the consent form. You're 5 questions in. And then you get to this question, which theory of time do you endorse? And then you see 2 multiple choice response options, A theory and B theory. And maybe you'll see, some other theory, what my Uncle Ted told me once about time. Time is like an umbrella. Who knows? They could put some weird options in there if they want. So you have those options, and then you see, okay, well, if I want to proceed, it looks like I got to pick one, So people will pick one, and they'll pick one regardless. If they don't have to understand what the hell you're asking them. They don't have to understand the response option. They don't have to understand the question. They don't have to agree with the view. They could think, I don't know what A or B theory are. They could think, I actually endorse C theory. Where's C theory? It's not even on here. And so you're giving them what's called a forced choice question. And you can get people that are responding to a forced choice question. There's a couple problems with that. One problem with that is that a person may simply not have a view, or they may not have a view reflected in the response options that you're giving them. And then as a result, they are choosing a response option even though it does not reflect their actual point of view. Another possibility is that people do not interpret your question or your response options, or both, in the way that you intend. And so if that happens, they might choose a response option that you interpret to mean a particular thing, but they interpret it to mean something else. And in that case, it might look like, oh yeah, they chose a response, so they endorse what I think they endorse, when actually they don't. They endorse some other point of view. But there are other possibilities as well. Here's another one, and I think that this hasn't received enough attention. What if a person has never thought about the particular point of view before? They haven't thought about different theories of time. And then when you ask them the question, maybe there's enough context or clues in the way that you're asking them for them to think about it and then form a view. So for instance, if you're giving someone a study on a survey on free will, and they don't really know the terms, determinism, compatibilism, libertarian free will, that sort of thing, but you tell them, hey, here's what we want to know. Some scientists believe, some philosophers believe, that all events could be predicted in principle by antecedent conditions. They're necessitated by them. And so, if we know what the initial conditions of the universe are, every event that happens after that is ultimately predictable and couldn't be changed from the way that it is. The universe has a set course that it is going through. And we want to know whether you think that point of view, not that you endorse that point of view, but if that point of view is true, could we still have free will? Is free will compatible with that point of view? And then your response options are, no, free will is not compatible with that point of view, or yes, free will is compatible with that point of view. Now, in that case, you might have given people enough context for them to form a position, even if they'd never entertained this possibility before. And in that case, you can have a phenomenon that I call spontaneous theorizing. And so what's happening is that the participants are actually forming a view in the course of participating in the study. Now, you might think, okay, well then big deal. Now we know what views people form under these conditions. The problem is that that study could have very poor external validity. It's not telling you a whole lot about what people think outside the experimental context, because the experimental context is actually changing the participant. It's causing them to think about things that they hadn't thought about before participating in the study. And so if it turns out that people only ever form a view, let's say they form a view where 80% of people endorse compatibilism, it doesn't matter what the actual numbers are, but let's just suppose that was the case. Can we then conclude that 80% of the general public are compatibilists? No. We might think 80% of people are disposed towards compatibilism, but that doesn't mean that they actually endorse compatibilism any more than, we could point to any made up set of considerations, look at the kinds of choices people would make. We can't extrapolate from that is in fact a view that they already hold. You could then at best talk about a disposition to hold this view. Even there, though, there are potential concerns. And one of those concerns would be that simply because people have a disposition at a percent of, 80% of participants tend to endorse this view, given the stimuli, like the exact way you frame the question, the context in which you asked it, the response options that they're given, that sort of thing. It doesn't mean you get the same proportion under different conditions. And it doesn't mean that there's some sort of universal tendency for people to think a particular way. You'd still have questions about generalizability. So spontaneous theorizing, I think, is a potentially substantial concern when it comes to a lot of abstract philosophical consideration, because it's possible that abstract philosophical considerations are not a pre-existing character, like a feature of the way that ordinary people were already disposed to think. And it may not be a feature that's implicit in the way that they speak either. So it could be that, we could just go look at people's language and their behavior and think, well, what's the best characterization of their philosophical views given this stuff, even if they don't have like a conscious position on the matter. But the problem is that in a lot of those cases, my view is that their judgments and their behavior are equally compatible with competing philosophical accounts. So some people might think, well, look, people go around making moral judgments. They object to people acting particular ways. They judge other people. They oppose certain sorts of things. Clearly, they act like moral realists. And you'll often see moral realists say things like, nobody can live like an anti-realist. This is, there's not a super nice way to put it. It's just nonsense. It's just nonsense. Nothing about being a moral anti-realist prevents you from objecting to other people's actions, from having moral standards, from condemning other people, from acting morally more or less in the same way as a moral realist. Any more than, consider your perspective on food. Do you think food would like taste better and you'd be more interested if you were a gastronomic realist that thought that there were stance independent facts about what food was good or bad? Probably not. I very much doubt it. People will go around not wanting to eat certain foods and wanting to eat other foods and having attitudes about food. The difference there is not so much the meta-normative attitudes that one has towards gastronomy or food and drink and morality. It's not so much whether one is a realist or an anti-realist about them. For instance, you could be a subjectivist about food and a realist about morality. None of that is especially relevant to how one acts. The main difference between those two domains, like normative domains, insofar as they really are, there is these principal distinctions. I don't actually think that there are, is that one's gastronomic norms typically are sort of circumscribed to one's own actions up to, at least up to a point. So most of us, if I like chocolate more than vanilla, I don't really care if other people like vanilla more than chocolate, at least not very much. I actually think this is not entirely always true. I think people will get kind of upset if people have really terrible like music or movie preferences. Like, you like that, you like Fast and Furious more than, I don't know, some allegedly good movie. Give me an example of a good movie and I'll run with it. A supposedly, good movie according to people that think that, have these like, I don't know, high art positions on what kind of movies are good. I've never really liked that kind of perspective. I'll enjoy a stupid movie and think it's just as good as some really fancy, sophisticated movie. So, in these cases, the difference really is that with respect to moral standards, people often want the standard to apply to other people as well. They prefer that other people comply with those standards. Whereas with a lot of our sort of taste preferences, and it could be, aesthetic and food and drink and that sort of thing, we don't have a strong standard that a strong preference that other people share our preferences. And we don't typically have a motivation to impose those standards on others. So for instance, if a person thinks murder is wrong, they typically have an attitude like this. Look, I don't want to murder. I would feel bad if I did it. And I don't want anyone else to murder. Murder's bad. Nobody should murder. It doesn't matter if they're on the other side of the planet and they would never murder me or anyone that I care about. I still don't want them to murder. Nobody should murder. So that is a component of it's a common sentiment that is a feature of a moral stance that someone might have. Whereas if someone likes pineapple on pizza, you are not typically going to find people that are like lobbying to make it mandatory to eat pineapple on pizza. They're not going around saying those people people on the other side of the planet don't eat pineapple on their pizza. It's an outrage. Let's force them to eat pineapple on their pizza. They better eat it. And so some people will conflate that sort of consideration with, you must be a realist about morality and an anti-realist about food because you want to impose your moral standards, but not impose your food standards. But actually a desire and a willingness and a motivation to impose a particular normative standard on others is orthogonal to realism. Because realism is about whether the facts about what's right or wrong are true independent of your goal standards or values. You can have an anti-realist universal standard. So you could think, look, my preference is that everyone must eat pineapple on the pizza. That's how I prefer the world is. I prefer other people do that. Now, that's a weird stance, and most people probably don't have stances like that when it comes to food, but there's nothing logically inconsistent about having a universal anti-realist standard. So there's just, in practice, an anti-realist can be just as disposed towards having a universal moral standard, even if they don't think the standard is stance independently true. And that shouldn't be too baffling to people. Let's just say you don't think there's any objective moral standards, no stance independent moral standards. You're not a moral realist. You could still want it to be the case that nobody anywhere murders one another. So there's not a problem there. And so if a person's running around opposing murder and voting on laws against murder and saying people shouldn't murder each other anywhere in the world, that's just not incompatible with anti-realism. And nothing about being against murder very strongly, very passionately is in any way an indication that you're a moral realist. It's just not. I mean, it could be as a matter of empirical fact. It could be that in practice, anti-realists are ambivalent about murder or something. But that would be a contingent feature of human psychology. It's not like a logical entailment to the positions. And yet you will see not only non-specialists talk this way, but even some specialists in philosophy will characterize anti-realism as though it has these normative implications that it simply doesn't have. And that's, really strange. Okay. To what you're saying about scientists, phil sci people were more disposed to anti-realism in PhilPapers. Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. In fact, let's go have a look at that. I want to have a look at that. All right, I am looking up the survey results now, and let's have a look. I wonder how often they're going to do these, because they did one in 2009 and then one in 2020. So it'd be strange if they do them every 11 years specifically, although that would be kind of a fun way to do it. All right, let's see. Realism. Meta-ethics, moral realism, and anti-realism. Oh, let me post a link to this in the chat so you can have a look. And let me get caught up with people. I was talking about, sorry, someone said, what did I miss? I was mentioning that I finished my PhD officially. So I'm now Dr. Bush. Still call me Lance. That's what I would prefer. I don't want to be called doctor. So I mentioned that. I mentioned that I got a Discord. I don't know if you're over here from Discord, but anybody on YouTube that wants to hop over to Discord, please do. I posted a link in the community, like the community section of YouTube. So check that out. And then anybody from Discord for the YouTube channel, please like, subscribe, do all that stuff. Now that I've got everything, all that stuff behind me, I do really want to grow the channel too. I just passed 400 subscribers, I think yesterday. So please like the video, share the video, subscribe if you haven't done so already. Do all that stuff. Help me get my stuff out here. Even if you hate it and you want to send it to people so they can laugh at me and talk about how stupid and wrong I am about philosophy, that's totally fine. Go ahead and do that. So I talked about that, and then I talked a bit about Sturmer's views on error theory. So Sturmer holds this view that if you believe you don't have a reason to believe something, then you can't believe it. And what I said in response to that is that you could just deny that. You could just say, no, you could believe things even if you believe you don't have a reason to believe them. But very quickly, I should just say what the last response to that is, just to get it out of the way. I'm almost at the hour point. I haven't really done that. So another thing that I think people could do is to just say, look, we have to be clear about what's meant by reason. And when I say, I don't think I have a reason to believe error theory, what I could mean by that is I don't have a reason in a particular sense. I don't have a reason in a sense, for instance, that realists would subscribe to. And so you could say, for instance, by reason, if you're an error theorist, you might think this. You might think there are no stance-independent normative facts. And if there are no stance-independent normative facts, then there are no, you could say, let's say categorical reasons or stance-independent reasons or irreducibly normative reasons, some construal of reasons that is associated with that realist conception of normativity. So let's just call them normative reasons, just for the sake of simplicity. We could, work out exactly what the distinctions are. But let's say then that if you're a global error theorist, then you don't believe that there are normative reasons. Okay, well, if that's the case, then you might then think that you have no normative reasons for believing error theory, but you could endorse a different conception of reasons, according to which you can, and as a result, do believe error theory. There's no obligation on the part of error theorists to endorse any particular conception of reasons, because error theory I take to be a view about the semantics of moral claims and about the metaphysics of moral claims, about whether there are moral facts of a particular kind. But I don't take it to be a sort of definitional feature of the content of error theory that you must endorse that that there are normative reasons, or that there would have to be normative reasons in order to be able to, or one would have to believe that one has normative reasons in order to be able to believe things. Why can't an anti-realist also reject that? Why can't you? I think the answer is you can. So it's just not a problem. And that's the reaction that I have to Sturmer's account. I just don't, I reject both that there are stance-independent normative facts of any kind, and I reject the account of reason, some account of irreducible normative reasons or irreducible normativity, according to which reasons are construed in this sort of unanalyzable way where they're irreducible. And then I also reject the view according to which one would need to believe one has such reasons in order to, it's not the view that one must have such reasons, but I also reject the notion that if one believes one doesn't have reasons of that kind, then one literally cannot believe things, because I just don't take them to be any sort of necessary or important feature of having beliefs. I think you could believe things even if you believe you don't have irreducibly normative reasons for believing them. And so you could have you could have a sort of eliminativist account of reasons, according to which reasons are refer to consistency relations, and consistency relations are then cashed out as facts about the relation between one's goals and one's means of acting consistently with those goals. And then one could say something like this. I have the goal of having beliefs that accurately model what the world is like. This is just a simplistic control of this. I do think it would be consistent with the goal of believing things that accurately model the world as it is to believe error theory. And so it's consistent with my goal to do so. And so in that sense, I'm going to use the word the term reason to refer to that consistency relation. And so in that sense, I have a reason. And in that respect, you have a reason to believe error theory, but it's not a reason of the sort that a moral realist or even some anti-realists might endorse. So you just have a different kind of reason. Now, someone might say that that's revisionary. I mean, what is it you're revising? So I'm not going to accept that, because if the claim here is that we're describing ordinary language, I wouldn't accept that. And that's where I think I tend to disagree with error theorists. I think error theorists are often operating too closely within the framework of mainstream analytic philosophy. And so they might actually think, and that could be a feature of, in fact, I should just say, it is a feature of standard characterizations of error theory, that they do tend to have these more robust semantic theses. So an error theorist will tend to think ordinary people, like the meaning of ordinary moral claims is to assert these stance-independent moral facts. And because there are no such facts, ordinary moral claims are false. And that's what I reject. It's not that I reject that there are stance-independent moral facts. I do. I just reject that that's like the account of ordinary moral claims. And I also reject the notion that it's a feature of ordinary moral claims, and therefore, like, what moral claims mean or commit one to involves some sort of appeal to irreducible normativity. I just don't accept that that's true. I don't think there are irreducible normative facts. And I don't think that there is, sorry, I should say irreducibly normative reasons. I don't think that there are any things like that. But I don't think it's a feature of ordinary discourse or folk semantics that is what is meant by moral claims in the first place. And so the final approach one could take is to just reject error theory and endorse an anti-realism that rejects the semantic thesis itself. And so you could say, yeah, there are no stance-independent normative facts, and there's no reason to believe that there are stance-independent normative facts, but one can still believe that there are no stance-independent normative facts. In other words, one can be a global normative anti-realist, but reject error theory. And I guess that's what I would take to be the most appealing view. I guess if I could revise what I said initially or retract what those, well, I'm not going to retract the initial remarks, but if you're operating within the I'm going to believe error theory, I think that you have some options that would allow one to believe error theory and reject some of the elements of Sturmer's characterization. If you don't want to believe error theory, but you want to deny that there are stance-independent normative facts of any kind, you just reject error theory, deny that there's stance-independent normative facts, and deny the other sorts of components of Sturmer's account. And that's ultimately the route that I would go with. Okay, so that wraps up that reply. That was a little disjointed. It popped up in different places, but whatever. I never claimed to be organized in the live streams, although sometimes I am. Sometimes I read through a blog post, but I didn't feel like doing that today. Okay, let's get to some comments. Is this an analytic issue in literature studies? We don't often interact with analytic philosophy, more often dealing with the continental tradition, or more often broad anti-realist, I think. Yeah, some people might take it to be an analytic issue. I don't really know. I mean, different people are going to have different perspectives on this. As I'd said earlier, I wouldn't approach the question of whether people can or do have particular beliefs to be like a priori question, or a question to be resolved in some sort of a priori way, as if there were a fact of the matter about it. I take an approach that's more like, okay, well, hold on. I don't think there's a fact of the matter about the fundamental nature of belief that's true independent of any particular perspective. Rather, I take the approach that if we're going to talk about beliefs, we just got to be clear on what it is that we mean. And on some controls, people can and do believe error theory, and on some controls, they can't or don't. So you just got to be clear on what you mean by belief. So I tend to dislike these types of a prioristic approaches that try to pin down fixed and rigid meanings to particular sorts of terms. Certain forms of realism will affect one's normative ethics, though, so they can affect one's behavior and make a difference. That's probably true. It's also true, just to add to that. Now, I think it's generally the case that, I mean, broadly speaking, there are many, many meta-ethical positions that I think wouldn't lead to, or at least don't entail, distinguishable differences in people's behavior. And I think this is probably true of the majority of meta-ethical positions that are endorsed in the literature. But in practice, yeah, certain forms of realism might have substantive implications for one's meta-ethical view, normative views and one's behavior. And the same is also true of certain anti-realist positions, where they, if you're a certain kinds of nihilist, or you think there are, like, nothing matters or something like that, then that might influence your behavior in certain sorts of ways. I also think that there are probably in practice some psychological effects. So I think if you are an anti-realist, it's plausible that you might be a little less disposed towards engaging in normative ethics, because it might be a little innovating and feel a little futile, because the project would need to be reconstrued to be doing something different than what realists take themselves to be doing. I don't know. I mean, it could motivate someone to do normative ethics. Maybe one would find it to be a more tractable challenge on an anti-realist view than a realist view. And in that case, then it could increase the degree to which one is invested in pursuing the question. In practice, I think a lot of these questions are going to come down to contingent and probably variable features of human psychology. They're not going to be logical entailments of these positions. Okay, this now seems to be some sort of habit of majesty of reason. So let's see what we got here. We can believe error theory. Okay, the real question is, can we believe that land suppresses the truth of moral realism in unrighteousness? The answer is yes, I do suppress the truth in unrighteousness. All right. Let's see. I think that's it for metaethics stuff. All right. Well, the hour mark is okay. I was hoping with bringing the Discord thing here that more people will be jumping in to talk about metaethics and error theory and anti-realism and all that stuff. Maybe we'll start getting more people. I do see more people in the stream, so thanks everyone for being here. Maybe people don't know me very well and they just want to hear me out instead of engaging with me. But yeah, if does anyone, I could post a link to StreamYard if anyone wants to come on and talk about metaethics. So you're welcome to do that. I'm not going to address issues that fall outside the scope of what the channel is about. So if you want to ask me about other sorts of topics or argue with me about them, this isn't the place for that. I'm not going to do that. So if people want me to get into other sorts of topics, it's just not going to happen. And if you try to get me to do it, I'm just not. It's just not going to happen. So today we're talking about metaethics. I'm also happy to talk about metaphilosophy. If you have questions about moral psychology, I don't know a whole, I may or may not know whatever you have questions about or you want to discuss there as well. And if you have a perspective on these things, you're welcome to come on. Is there anybody that wants to do that? We'll give people a few minutes. I think I will pop out and take a break. And then I don't know if people are coming over from Discord or something, people could consider whether they want to come on here. I guess for now, I'll also post a link. Now, I'm not going to bring you on immediately. I'm probably going to, if you want to come on, you'll be backstage. I'll probably have a few questions before you do that. And if nobody wants to come on, we could close things out early today. That's totally fine. I've done these sometimes for 3 or 4 hours, and sometimes they're just an hour. All right, so that should be the link. And I'll replace that, and I will be back in a couple minutes. I'm going to go grab a drink and take a quick little break. All right, I am back. Give me 1 second. Looks like we may have a guest. Give me 1 moment. Let's just bring you on and see what happens. Welcome, welcome. Are you there? Sorry, I
Hello.
a couple more minutes than I expected. How's it going?
Okay, sorry, I'm a little shy. Hello, how are you?
Good, good, good. So, what did you want to talk about?
Right. Yeah, one thing that seems really, and I think you mentioned this, is there seems to be this reification of reasons. And, there's this perfectly, I don't know, normal sense of reason, right? Like, a friend says something like, I think so and so will win the next election. You say, oh, what's your reason for thinking that? There doesn't seem to be anything wrong with that. But I get the impression that the way philosophers are using the word doesn't seem to be like that. And all of this talk of this whole sort of talk, right? Of, well, you can, if you believe error theory, you have no reason for believing it. Once you just sort of disambiguate this notion of reason, I think there's not going to be a problem.
Yeah, so I am very much inclined to agree. And that reminds me, I never got to giving the construal of reasons that I saw in Strumer's paper. I should briefly mention what that paper is, and then I'll address this more. It's called Can We Believe the Error Theory? And then I went up to check the title, and then I lost the point in the page. I was like, okay, I went right back to it. Awesome. So here's how reason is characterized in the paper. I shall use the term, quote, reason for belief to mean a consideration that counts in favor of a belief. That's it. And my concern with that, and then there is a footnote which says, I use the term consideration to remain neutral on whether reasons for belief are facts, propositions, or beliefs. So my concern with this is I don't know what that means. And it's not just that I don't know what that means. I'm not sure it means anything. It seems at best underdeveloped and possibly meaningless. Now, one of the more annoying mischaracterizations people have made towards my perspective, which I call the unintelligibility thesis, which is that certain terms and concepts that are widely in use among contemporary analytic philosophers working in metaethics are unintelligible, particularly those concepts as they're employed by, for the most part, non-naturalists, moral realists, but sometimes other people, anti-realists as well, will use these terms and concepts. I don't think they're meaningful. It's not just that I don't know what it means. And I certainly don't think if I don't know what something means, therefore it's not meaningful. It's that I don't think it's meaningful. And that's why I don't know what it means. I can't know what something means if it doesn't mean anything. So people get the causality here backwards. They think that I'm inferring it's not meaningful because I don't know what it means. But rather, it's that because I think it doesn't mean anything, therefore I conclude I don't know what it means. So they get it backwards. But I mean, look at that. And you'll see this all the time. I ask people, what do you mean by reason? And they say, well, it's something that counts in favor. What the hell does that mean? Counts in favor. Counts in favor. How? Motivationally, what do you mean by counts in favor? What does that mean? And so what you'll get when you ask people like philosophers, people that I guess are defending this approach to talking about reasons, is when you ask them what they mean by reason, they'll either go straight to it's unanalyzable, it's irreducible, it's primitive, you can't articulate what it means, or they'll give you this weird Mobius strip of other terms where you'll say, what do you mean by reason? Oh, it's something that counts in favor. What do you mean by counts in favor? Oh, well, it's, and then they might use some other term or phrase, and they're all equally obscure, and they just give the impression that an answer has been given. But, imagine if you had no idea about anything in biology, and you said, like, what's a mitochondria? And someone said it's come up with another fancy sounding term for mitochondria, or it's just a silly one, a florp. Mitochondria are florps. And you go, okay, that's also a proper term. I don't know what that means. What's a florp? Oh, it's a zippity dip. It's not a characterization of what it is. So when someone tells me that a reason is something that counts in favor, and then you go, what does that mean? They'll run you through this loop. So here's what will tend to happen. What's a reason? It's an unanalyzable concept. I can't tell you. Okay, so it's mysterious. Or they'll give you this Mobius strip of it's a florp. What's a florp? It's a zippity dip. What's a zippity dip? It's a reason. I'm sorry, it counts in favor. What do you want me to do? And then they after they run you through the loop, they'll act like you're the asshole for asking them, and it's like, you're being impertinent. Why are you pressing me on this? It's obvious. It's a zippity dip. Come on now. And so they run you through this obscurity loop, hoping you will shut up and leave them alone. But if pressed too much, then they'll go straight to the first option, which is it's unanalyzable. I can't tell you what it means. Then why did you do the runaround thing? Why didn't you just tell me that to begin with? If that's so, what are you doing? So to me, these are like, they almost look like fake characterizations. They're like pseudo characterizations. I don't know. Is that your impression?
So I think there is one construal of counts in favor that makes sense, but it would just be motivational. Like there's certain features of a car that count in favor of me buying the car, but that seems to me just a mundane like fact about my psychology. And there's certain things I just enjoy about cars that, if the car has these features, I'm more likely to buy it. But then those are just sort of mundane descriptive facts.
Right. And that's precisely the sorts of things that they are excluding by stipulation. That's not a feature of this. So, look, there are these everyday uses of the term. In fact, before I get to that, I should say one of the things that will happen, and one of the things that I think that this Mobius strip of terminology, and actually Pete Mandic has a great characterization of this in his quietism paper. I'm going to try to pull that up. 1 second.
I have a lot of problems with that area of philosophy as well.
I'll have to look for it. I'm not going to bother digging it up right now. But basically, it's this the characterization, and I've used similar characterizations, is that you have this sort of mutually interdefining web of terms that sort of never touch ground. It's just A means B, B means C, C means A means B, and you just go in this loop, and it never gets anywhere. And Mandic observes that this seems to happen with discussions about phenomenal states or qualia. And I agree. And so when I read that paper, I was immediately like, this is the view for me, qualia quietism. And I do the same thing about reasons. I say I'm a reasons quietist. I'm a quietist about irreducible normativity and about this notion of normative reasons. So, you get that sort of runaround where what will happen, and this is part of why I think it's sort of dialectically or rhetorically useful, but not so much useful if we're actually trying to make progress, is if someone says, look, a reason is something that counts in favor, and you go, what do you mean by that? They'll go, oh, you don't know what it means for something to count in favor? So they'll, you might get this kind of incredulity, like, you're an idiot for asking them what they mean. Yeah, it's people do this for definitions in general. They say, you don't know what such and such means. And it's very weird. What do you mean if I don't know what it means? As if there's this singular fact of the matter and that we all have to converge on it. No, I'm not saying I don't know what it means. I'm asking you what you mean when you use that. I could tell you what I mean, but you're going to say that, well, that's not what I mean. So you can have a view of counts in favor that's perfectly sensible. It's cashed out in terms of desires or goals or values or whatever. And so would I. I can talk about things counting in favor. I could say the fact that it's going to miss sunny out tomorrow counts in favor of me going for a walk. Well, if you ask me, what do you mean by counts in favor? I would say it's not a technical term. This is just a loose way of me saying, hey, I want to walk in the sunshine. It would be consistent with that goal to do so. And so it's going to be cashed out in terms of my desires. But then if I was talking to a person that endorses this other conception of these like external reasons, they're going to say, no, it has nothing to do with that. It's not about your desires. So this is not some Humean view. So, okay. So if you don't mean what I mean, then what do you mean? It's not that I don't know what it means. It's that I don't know what you mean. So I don't like that trick that people try to pull where they act like they're like, if you don't know what they mean, then you don't have any meaning. And what the trick here is to make it seem like you're rejecting or confused about ordinary language, as if you don't go around saying this counts in favor. Of course I say things count in favor. Of course I say people have reasons. I use all that language, but I just don't mean what the philosophers mean by it. What they're doing though, is they are juxtaposing and sort of strategically equivocating, whether it's intentional or not. In fact, I think it's not intentional. I think philosophers get tripped up over the connotations and pragmatic characteristics of ordinary language, and then they unwittingly equivocate between or shift between those ordinary usages and their technical, really highly specific and theoretically laden usages, and then act like if you reject their theoretically laden usage that you're rejecting the ordinary usage, which you are not. Of course, I'm not rejecting that like there are reasons. I'm rejecting their conception of reasons. But then what they'll do is they'll say, well, my conception of reasons is the correct account of reasons. And so if you don't know what my account is, you don't know what reasons are at all. And you don't get to use the word, as if they're like seizing ordinary language. I don't know. That's my impression.
Right. Yeah, I think it seems to me a lot of the problems in philosophy just come from an abuse of ordinary language. Or it can just be reduced to straightforward empirical claims, like, for example, in an unrelated area, personal identity. I'm not exactly sure. So when people ask, is it the same person after he steps into the teletransporter? Is that an empirical claim of people's identity attributions or whatever? But it seems that insofar as people aren't making mundane empirical claims, a lot of the time it's sort of just unclear what kind of claims they're making. Like you said, correct account of reasons. I mean, does he mean how reasons are used in ordinary language, like how the word is used in English? Or I suppose an over-reliance on English might be another problem with philosophy. But leaving that aside, what exactly would a correct account of reasons be? Just an account of how the word is used in English, or maybe some sort of empirical claim of, I don't know, human cognition. But that would just, I guess at that point you would just do neuroscience or something. So I'm not even, I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm not really sure what a correct account of reasons would even be.
Yeah, it's not super clear. I still have not gotten any sort of definitive or satisfactory solution as to whether the descriptive element of metaethical accounts with respect to realism and anti-realism are even intended to be empirical or not. You do have philosophers like Don Loeb who will just outright say, and he does so in his paper Moral Incoherentism, that a lot of the claims being made are empirical. And Gill seems to construe it that way, and at least cites the empirical literature that had started to look at this work at the time that paper was published. But when I've posed this question, I get a mixed response. Some people say, no, these are not empirical questions. And other people say, yes, they are. And I think that this generalizes to a lot of other sorts of things. There are probably areas of philosophy where this is less of an issue, where those areas are less concerned with characterizing, say, ordinary language. Maybe some questions in philosophy of science have to do with characterizing science. And so they're already dealing with something technical. And so they're not even attempting to characterize ordinary language. I don't know, because I'm not a philosopher of science. But there might be areas where this is less of a concern. But yeah, I'm not clear on whether claims are supposed to be empirical or not. But you do have people like Williamson who will sort of characterize philosophy as continuous with the empirical sciences, and then will see what philosophers are doing as in a certain respect empirical, even when they're appealing to intuitions or something like that. And yet, if that's the case, then I just question whether they're using a good method. So it's like, okay, you take the question to be an empirical one, and if it's an empirical question about what people mean when they say something, let's get clear on what you're trying to develop a theory of. It's a theory of linguistic usage, of only English speakers, or of all languages. And if it's of all languages, why would you only consult your intuitions about how English speakers speak? Even if you had an accurate sense of how English speakers speak, which I don't even think philosophers have a good grip on, what does that tell you about people in other languages? I don't know. It's an empirical question which terms are lexicalized in other languages. It's an empirical question how much overlap there is in the usage. It seems strange. It seems like philosophers presuppose all languages have the same content.
Right, especially considering, for example, a lot of East Asian languages, at least from what I know, seem very different from English. I guess I'd be interested in seeing more empirical research on that. But so I know some Japanese, and it's a very, very different language from English, just from what I picked up. So it, like, for a lot of these traditional philosophical questions, like, it's not clear to me how, say, Japanese speakers would think of them. And it may be that really, that's lost where I was going to go with that.
No, that's okay. Yeah, I do wonder about this. And, even if philosophers are familiar with some other languages, I mean, how much philosophy, keep in mind that for many of them, like let's say I went and studied another language. Even if I did, I'm doing that as an adult. I'm doing that with decades of a Western, and you could say weird. So for anyone that's not familiar, there's this paper back from 2010 by Henrik Hein and Norman Zion called The Weirdest People in the World. WEIRD is an acronym that was proposed to mean Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. It picks out specific populations that are the primary target of psychological research. Empirical research has shown that those populations tend to be psychologically unrepresentative of most of the rest of the world's populations. Now, even if I learn another language and learn about another culture, I still have decades of that sort of, you could say that the weird mindset is imprinted on my brain, and it's going to influence the way I construe those cultures and their language. I'm going to sort of impose top down my categories and conceptions and theory laden way of thinking about things onto my conception of that language and culture. And so even if we went out and we studied all these other cultures, if we ourselves are already steeped in a particular culture, that bias is irrevocable. So it's just not something that we're going to be able to just completely eliminate. What we would need is a truly robust cross-cultural philosophy where we recruited people from all around the world from different cultural backgrounds and linguistic backgrounds. It's the only way to do it. That is going to be a problem too, because what are we going to do? Train them all by having them read Hume and Kant, like English translations of Kant, and read a bunch of philosophy in English? Okay, so we're going to induct them into weird and Western conceptions of philosophy. So then we're just training them to think the way we do. If we really want to have access to the counterfactual, what we would need is fundamentally autonomous philosophical histories that are developed outside of a weird philosophical trajectory. And so I think philosophy may be extremely path dependent and highly historically contingent. I shouldn't say philosophy. Specifically, contemporary analytic philosophy is a product of a very particular, narrow, and psychologically idiosyncratic culture. And I have no particularly good reasons to think that the products of that philosophy are triangulating on the truth, and that if we had other cultures, they would all triangulate on the same truth as well. I don't know why I should suppose that that's true.
Right. That reminded me of something earlier you said about the reasons Mobius strip. And so one thing that, say, maybe a proponent of this characterization of reasons might say is that, okay, fine, I can maybe give you examples, say it different ways or whatever, and you might not be able to get the concept, but that's not a problem because there are all of these other concepts that are like that. So, for example, energy in physics, for example. Like if somebody asked me what's energy, I'd say, I just say, well, it's like, gravitational potential energy, kinetic energy, electrical energy, et cetera, et cetera. Just to tie it back to this, I guess what somebody might say is that it may be the case that lots of human knowledge is like that it's sort of a parochial feature of certain cultures. So, for example, it seems that, for example, most physicists, just from my understanding of history of physics, were from certain parts of the world like Europe and North America. So perhaps somebody could just launch the same criticism on other areas of human knowledge that I'm guessing you're not suspicious of physics. I'm just going to assume that, but
I am not. I'm pretty on board with science. Yeah, someone could try to make an analogy and say, maybe we should be skeptical of science. I'm not though, but I take that. I think that there's particular reasons why I'm less skeptical of the sciences than I am of philosophy, and this is something that I outline in some of my criticisms of philosophy, which is that if we're looking at, say, for instance, philosophical expertise. When I critique these appeals to, well, most philosophers think this, so you should think it. My concern there, and this is really something a friend of mine pointed out to me So credit to them for this way of framing it, is that in a certain sense it gets things backwards. So the reasons why I consider doctors and engineers and computer scientists and everybody to be experts in the relevant domains, I don't have to know any, like if so, you tell me this person's doctor and they have their medical degree from such and such a place, I don't have to know directly that that person is an expert. I mean, I would presume that they probably are, but that's because they're part of an institution with an established track record of instilling and demonstrating expertise. And of course, people can also directly demonstrate expertise. If there's a person I don't know and they say they're an expert at chess and I have no way of verifying that, I don't see like their official rankings or something, I could play them. And if they just totally demolish me 20 times in a row, okay, then they're probably at least better than me at chess. I may not be a good judge of how good they are at chess because I'm so bad. I wouldn't be able to recognize someone that's just enough better than me to always win, to like Magnus Carlsen. But still, I could watch them play someone that I do know is an expert. And if they totally demolish that person, now I know they're good. So there's at least that. So there's direct demonstration, this sort of indirect demonstration of expertise in virtue of being part of an institution that has expertise. Now, in that case, it's that you demonstrate in practical, real-world, observable ways expertise, and therefore I presume you're an expert. Whereas what I see with a lot of people appealing to philosophical expertise, it's that they have not demonstrated any expertise. It's that they have declared themselves the experts, and therefore that is supposed to serve as the demonstration that they have that, like, you know, they don't have to demonstrate they're experts, and therefore I should believe them. It's that I should believe them. I should believe whatever it is they purport to demonstrate is true because they're experts, even though I have no direct access to it. So if the realists claim they can perceive moral facts, that not only can I not perceive moral facts, that sounds totally bonkers to me. But I'm just, if most of them think that, then I'm supposed to just take their word for it. I don't think so. If most biologists said that there was a special type of animal, and then the rest of us who were not biologists said, okay, where is it? And I can't show you. Only biologists can see it. I think we would be pretty suspicious of biologists. So I think that there's something backwards here. But that's the difference. That's that's a big part of the difference of why I'm not as skeptical of physics, because physics has a track record of success. If our understanding of physics wasn't good, we wouldn't be able to make the predictions we do. We wouldn't be able to land Mars rovers, you know, that sort of thing. And we can, so I believe them. If philosophers could make predictions about moral facts and then I go and I find one buried somewhere, maybe I'd start taking philosophers more seriously in terms of their expertise.
So I guess what you're saying is, in something like the natural sciences, there's some method of resolving any sort of dispute of expertise. So for example, if I think that, you know, physics or chemistry or biology or whatever is just hokey, I suppose the scientist could take me aside and say, hey, this is going to happen. And presumably it happens. And then I have some method, some way of knowing that this person is an expert. But in philosophy, all we sort of have is the assurances of philosophers.
Yeah, that's pretty much all we have. Now, someone might say I'm begging certain questions or I'm skipping over certain sorts of things. I'm not necessarily purporting to have some sort of principled philosophical position here, but I am making an observation, which is that doctors save lives. I haven't seen philosophers demonstrate that they, and I don't even know what it would look like in principle for them to like demonstrate that they have the correct intuitions. And they might not like the standards that I'm using, but tough. I can use them all I want. There's nothing I can do about it. So what are they going to do? Ban me?
Threaten you?
I don't know. So yeah, so there is that difference there. But yeah, this reason stuff, I don't understand its persistence or why people don't see a problem here. But talking about everyday uses of reason, when I discuss this, if someone says, let's say I went to the store and someone says, well, what reason did you have for going to the store? It might be a little awkward way for someone to put it. But I could say, well, the reason was to buy some things that I needed. I needed to get, I need to buy some bagels. So that was my reason. My reason was that I wanted bagels. And so if you ask me for the reason, I could give you a reason. In that sense, it's sort of fleshed out. There's content to it. What is the reason? Well, it's that I wanted bagels. Or what is the reason? It's that I needed to do this. But the kinds of reasons that philosophers often point to is if someone said, well, what reason do you have for not committing murder? It's more like, well, hold up. No. It's not that they're like, I can't tell you what the reason is. It's just you have a reason, simpliciter. Like there just is a reason. What does that mean? I am curious. this idea of these sort of like reason simpliciter, if you could somehow communicate that notion to non-philosophers, whether they would be like, yeah, I think there's stuff like that, or whether they go, what are you talking about? That sounds ridiculous. I don't know what they would say.
Right. Well, I guess what someone would say when you ask, well, what's your reason to, or what a philosopher might say is, when you ask what's the reason to not murder someone, you might say, well, it's because it will, end this person's life or whatnot. But I suppose the problem with that is you can always say, well, I think that's awesome. That's what I want to do. And it's not clear how that, then it would just, seems like it would be a reason for you to murder somebody.
Yeah. I mean, there's a few things that might be at play here, and one concern for me is why are at least many philosophers so reluctant to characterize, like, to be Humeans about reasons? I'm not even a Humean about reasons, so just cashing out reasons in terms of their connection to desires. Why not cash it out that way? If everybody's a Humean, I think I wouldn't even be doing what I'm doing. So they would just say, yeah, your reasons for doing things have to do with your desires. Part of it is I think that there's this threat of something highly contingent and arbitrary about that. My honest impression is that the persistence and resurgence of realism is in some way connected to the history of Western philosophy, and its history in, I guess I would just say, I think it's in part Platonism, but also in part Christianity. And I think Christianity has instilled this Manichaean sense of this stark division between good and evil. Generation after generation has been instilled with this sense of good and evil. And with the loss of the decline of Christianity, like, most philosophers are atheists, and the field is very secular. I think that philosophers never really recovered from the existential crisis that followed from that sense of the God was the ground of meaning and value and purpose in the universe. And without God, there's no meaning, value, and purpose. And, some initial, you could say, brave philosophers embraced that and said, yeah, nihilism all the way. And you build your own damn value. But I think a lot of philosophers are not satisfied with that. And I think that looming abyss of nihilism is daunting and very unappealing. And I think that makes moral realism an extremely attractive position, I think, for reasons unrelated to its plausibility as a view. It's a, call it the opiate of the field, in a certain sense.
So I'm not sure I'd agree with that characterization, simply because even in Christianity, it seems that people are encouraged to do good and bad things just through reward and punishment, right? If you're a good person, you go to heaven. If you're a bad person, God's going to punish you and send you to hell, right? So it's not even clear to me that Christians endorse moral realism in the sense that, say, a philosopher would. And I mean, you obviously can't do this, but if you were to go back in time and talk to the church fathers and ask them, well, hey, why do this, right? Well, or why not? Why should I not murder somebody, right? You might just say, well, if you do it, you'll go to hell. And presumably that's supposed to resonate with me, right? It's supposed to be this awful place. And so what I'm trying to say is I'm not sure even in Christianity that Christians would accept the characterization of moral realism that philosophers hold.
Yeah, I don't think that they do. And if I give that impression, then I apologize. So I do not think that Christians are or were, for the most part, moral realists. I think that Christianity, by whatever means it was able to do so, I don't think it required any substantive philosophical stance on metaethics, was the sort of primary source of meaning, purpose, and value. And then in its absence, people felt a loss of meaning, purpose, and value. I think realism in its current form is a more recent invention by philosophers. I think it's a kind of, I'm almost inclined to say it's a kind of crypto-theistic way of smuggling the supernatural elements of the moral worldview of Christianity in through the back door. And it's been sort of repurposed. So yeah, I don't think, and in fact, I'm going to have a blog post about this, probably do a video about it. I sometimes see people argue with me, and I should backtrack a little bit. I don't know how familiar you are with my empirical work on this stuff.
I've heard you talk of how people. I've heard you talk of how people use moral language and what people's views are on metaethics. So I believe you talked about a study where I believe it was Polzer and Wright, where most of the participants endorsed anti-realist views.
Yeah, but I don't accept the results of that study. And even insofar as I do, I think that they have low generalizability. I do think that that's my favorite study that's been done on the topic. I think it was really rigorous, carefully done. So Polzer and Wright have been at the forefront of identifying methodological problems with earlier research in the psychology of metaethics. And this is a field of empirical inquiry, just for the audience's purpose, that looks at whether non-philosophers are realists or anti-realists about morality. And they also, some of the studies look at other domains as well, but the focus is typically morality. Now, those studies have quite a few methodological problems. It's really hard to ask these questions in a way. In fact, I asked a version of one of these questions for the community poll today. What they did is they identified a bunch of methodological problems, and they rewrote the instructions and response options and everything in their study to try to circumvent and minimize as many of those problems as possible. And they even put people through some short exercises to sort of get them to really understand the questions before they proceeded. It's great work. And what they found is about 75% of the respondents in their survey consistently favored anti-realist positions, with the substantial majority of those who express such views endorsing some type of relativism. I think cultural relativism was more common, but it's probably a combination. Maybe they were about even of subjectivism and cultural relativism. Maybe it was more subjectivism. So I take it back. I don't know. It's a combination of individual and cultural relativism. So in other words, error theory and non-cognitivism were a lot less popular. Now, the issue with that is that came from two populations: a student population. Students are more likely to be anti-realists, and Amazon's Mechanical Turk respondents, which are more likely to be atheist and agnostic, who are in turn more likely to be anti-realists. So it came from two populations that are disproportionately likely to give anti-realist responses. So it doesn't generalize too well to the rest of the United States, and it doesn't generalize to the rest of the world's population. Or at least if it does, we don't know that without further, like we need to replicate the studies in other populations. But that's not really my concern with that, and I don't want to get too much into that study. My overall interpretation of the literature, I endorse this view: metaethical indeterminacy. So I actually think that the participants in these studies are either forming the views in the context of participating in the study, and so it's not telling us a whole lot about people outside the study, or because they're responding to these sorts of questions, they're not interpreting them the way the researchers intended, or they're compelled to respond in ways that don't reflect their actual views, which I think typically don't involve any substantive meta-ethical commitments. This is probably a very radical perspective. I don't know too many other people that don't think non-philosophers have meta-ethical views, but that's my view. So I do not think that theists are moral realists. And this has gotten me into a couple disputes, or at least disagreements, where someone has said, people are theists, they're going to be realists. And I don't think so. So I do have a blog post coming out where I lay out a bunch of reasons why we cannot infer that the fact that someone is a theist is good evidence that they're a realist. I don't think that it is. I think most theists are neither realists nor anti-realists. Sorry, that was a long answer to get to that, but
not at all. I get your point, right? It would be, I suppose it would be like if you asked me some question on banking regulations, and then you just gave me some sort of, explanation of the regulation. I'm just going to make something up and answer the question, but that doesn't mean you can't infer from that I had some sort of stable view before you asked me the question.
That's exactly right. And so I ran a study to demonstrate this effect. So what I did was pretty straightforward. I first asked people, do you endorse an interpretation of quantum mechanics? And the vast majority of people did not endorse an interpretation of quantum mechanics, unsurprisingly. Now, if I did this at a physics convention or something, that might be a little different, but I did not. This was not specialists in physics for the most part. So most people didn't have a view about quantum mechanics. And then I said, all right, well, here's a little crash course in quantum mechanics. I probably wrote something wildly inaccurate. I wrote it myself. And then I gave them this characterization of the Copenhagen interpretation and the many worlds interpretation. I also did my best to try to make the many worlds interpretation look as silly as possible. So I really drummed up how absurd it sounds. Although I guess maybe I did that for the Copenhagen one. I have to go back and look. Anyway, the point here wasn't to give them a clear and unbiased characterization of the two views, although I don't think I made them super inaccurate. it was really to show, because a lot of researchers, their biases could sort of work their way into the stimuli anyway. So that's not really the issue here. The point is here, first you say, do you have a view about this issue? Almost nobody says yes. So the answer is no, they don't have a view. Then you expose them to the view and then give them the possible options that have been formulated by physicists, at least just two of the two most popular ones. And then I ask them, okay, well, now which view do you favor? And about 70% of people favored the Copenhagen interpretation. And then I asked people after that, did you feel like you had to answer even though this didn't accurately reflect your view? I don't remember the proportion, but it was a lot of people were like, yes, you didn't. I had no option. Your options are Copenhagen, many worlds. So they had a forced choice if they wanted to answer the question at all. They could just quit the study if they're like, I don't have to pick one. I'm leaving. You do have that option. You don't have to finish the study. But if you wanted to have your data recorded as picking an answer, you had to pick one. So a lot of people said, yeah, didn't reflect my view. And some people said no. And that's win-win for me, because think about it. Okay, so either they chose a response option that is not their view. Now, if any other study where people are forced to pick an answer that doesn't reflect their view, they're going to have a whole bunch of those people, but they didn't even ask them. So some percentage of the participants felt they had to pick a view, even though it wasn't a view that they endorsed. That's a problem. But the other one is a problem too, because keep in mind, they said they didn't have a view before they answered the question. So like 1 minute before that, they didn't have a view, or 2 minutes before. Now they have a view. Okay, so this isn't telling me what the person thought before they started the study. It's telling me what they thought after they read the stupid paragraph that I gave them. So, and that's what I call spontaneous theorizing. And so it's lose-lose. This is not, we're not finding out a whole lot about what people outside the study think about how to interpret quantum mechanics. And so what is that supposed to illustrate? It's pretty straightforward. What if a lot of our studies in experimental philosophy are like this? People don't have views about the questions, but then we give them a bunch of information and ask them, and they give an answer, and then we go, yeah, that's what people thought all along. But what if it's not? How would we know? No one bothered to ask. So I think it's a serious problem.
I suppose one other problem might be the sort of stability of these responses that people are giving. So, for example, what if over time, maybe even the next day or something, because people just aren't committed to these views. I suppose just like I wouldn't be committed to any sort of view on banking regulation. And, with maybe very little prodding, or people just shift their views. It's not the sort of stable commitment to a view that a philosopher might hold.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So on that note, I'll mention a couple things. The first is check out this book from Nick Chater called The Mind is Flat. And there's also another book called The Language Game with Chater and Christensen. And that's a book on language. The other one's on cognition. And what Chater argues in The Mind is Flat is that the mind is flat. There's not as much going on unconsciously as people seem to realize. And both of those books emphasize the importance of improvisation in both language and cognition, and how it's not like people go around having, at least in The Mind is Flat, this like deep principle. It's not like, at the tip, you have your sort of active consciousness, and then there's this massive iceberg underneath of all of your philosophical views. And what philosophers are doing when they conduct studies on people's like experimental philosophy is that they're sort of extracting those views from their unconscious database of implicit philosophical principles. No, it's that people are making them up on the spot. They're confabulatory. And there is research showing, for instance, here's something I bet you could do is I could ask people, which you run the same study, and then after people choose one of the views, let's say they choose Copenhagen, I give them some other task to do for 5 minutes, a personality questionnaire or something. And then I come back to it and I say, by the way, we saw that you chose the many worlds interpretation. I actually change. I just tell them, you lie to them. You tell them they actually chose the other one. And then you say, well, why did you choose the many worlds interpretation? You will probably get, and there's been research on this for other sorts of questionnaires, food preferences. Someone chooses Pepsi over Coke or whatever. And then you come back later and you say, why did you choose Coke over Pepsi? And the person goes, oh, for this reason, this reason, and this reason. Now, maybe for Pepsi and Coke, it won't work so well because people might have a settled and very conscious view on that. But take some spontaneous thing, like a red or green shirt. Which one do you want? Or something like that. Or which chocolate bar do you want? And then you tell the person they actually chose the other one. A lot of people will not notice you switched it and will just start giving reasons for the other one. And it's not like they ignored what you just told them. It's not like if a person chooses Snickers over Twix and then you tell them they chose Twix over Snickers, that they'll start giving a bunch of reasons why they like Snickers better, as if they didn't notice that you switched it. Rather, they don't notice that you switch it, but they do notice this like the switch without noticing it's a switch. So they'll start giving a bunch of reasons why they do like Twix better, even though that's not what they initially picked. And they might even say things about why Twix is better, like explicit Twix is better because. And so people will confabulate their answers. And yeah, instability here is a massive potential problem. It would be cool to do a follow-up study and test that. I suspect you could get people to shift their meta-ethical views all over the place, and they're probably very transient, and I think that they're probably not stable at all. I think philosophers probably in many cases mistakenly presuppose that our ordinary claims, like our moral claims, are driven by a stable commitment to a different one or another different meta-ethical position. And I just don't think there's any meta-ethical positions at play. But if there were, I think they would be highly unstable. Another thing to note about this is even if the person does form a determinate view about quantum mechanics or realism or anti-realism in the midst of a study, think about how shallow their understanding of those topics are. It would be like if someone gave a description of, I don't know, two different types of cars, a very superficial description of their specs, and asked me which one I think is better. And then I said, this one is better than that one. Ford is better than a Chevy, whatever. I don't know enough about mechanics to really have a substantive view there. So, even though I have a determinate view, it's a very shallow view in terms of its content. So those are two additional issues.
So one pushback I might have is perhaps people are just trying not to be difficult. Like, I don't know. Sometimes I'm like this. Like, I just don't want to be difficult, and they might be conflict averse. And when you say something like, "Oh, you pick this," they just don't want to, I suppose, anger you. Perhaps that's, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know how much they've tested that. So they probably, for some of these studies, have done some debriefing and things like that to try to sort out whether people are just being polite. But I think, as far as I can tell, the evidence on confabulatory responses is fairly strong. But hey, who knows? Maybe if I dig into that, I would find huge methodological problems. Pretty much every time I look into a literature, I find massive problems. So yeah, maybe the literature's not so good.
Is that so that's just something general in psychology? The literature is just not that great? Or?
Yeah. Are you familiar with the replication crisis at all?
So I've heard that a lot of results that people have held up in psychology, like implicit bias and whatnot, or perhaps not as there may not be anything there.
Yeah, a big one is like ego depletion. I think power posing hasn't replicated very well. There's specific literatures that like a whole literature hasn't replicated super well, but that's a specific question about particular literatures, and that's part of it, but it's not the whole thing. So the replication crisis refers more generally to the low replication rate within, I guess you could say, academic research, and a lot of that has been directed specifically at psychology, and in many cases, my own area, social psychology. So the replication crisis is really about low replication rate. Even if it's like a one-off study and it's not part of a broader literature, a lot of those studies don't replicate. A lot of classical studies don't replicate. And so there's been some problems with certain sorts of very large literatures, like ego depletion. I think there's several hundred, it's like 600 papers or something on ego depletion. And that whole thing never seemed to have solid theoretical foundations in the first place. The studies just don't replicate, that sort of thing. So the replication crisis, I think a lot of people would attribute it sometime around 2011. And I won't get super duper into the history, but there was a report in 2015 where they took a few top journals in psychology. They attempted to replicate studies from those journals. And they had something like a 36 or 39%, depending on how you construed what exactly they're looking at, of the studies replicated. So the majority of studies didn't replicate. And that was supposed to be out of these top journals. And, there are problems with some of the replication efforts. Maybe not all of them are super convincing. So I should just say, replications are when you take the same methods and like you basically try to repeat the study exactly as it initially been done, or at least you approximate it as closely as possible. And what this is supposed to show is that if you consistently find the same findings, that the effect that is picked out by those findings is probably real. And the replication crisis is the sort of discovery, realization, and attempt to address the fact that it looks like a lot of what was taken for granted and presumed to be true in psychology and in other fields probably isn't, that a lot of it does not replicate and may not be real. Now, that is going to be, there's going to be different areas of psychology where that is more or less of a problem. But I don't take replication to be the only issue. Oh, and then I should just say real quickly, why is this occurring? You might think a lot of people are faking their data. Now, data fabrication is a thing, but it's not the primary culprit here. So there are some high profile cases. I think Diedrich Stoppel, there's been a few other people do fabricate data. That is a factor, but it's might be one of the smallest factors, really. Which isn't to say it's negligible or unimportant. It's there, but big factors here really have more to do with p hacking. So it's like p-value hacking, which is that basically when people's data analytic approaches are too open-ended and loose, there's too many researcher degrees of freedom. When researchers have a bunch of data, there's so many analytic decisions that they can make that all those sorts of biases kick in, and people end up making decisions that optimize for finding results that tell people what they want. Now, this doesn't have to be a conscious thing. It's not like everybody's maliciously seeking out ways of manipulating data. It's more that people are driven to find conclusions for results they believe in, and they see them. What they're doing is an honest attempt at uncovering the truth, but their research is too open-ended, and people end up concluding things that just turn out not to be true. So that's going to be a big factor. There's other factors too. Publication bias. Journals want to publish positive findings, not negative findings. So you're going to see more in the literature that's positive than negative. So that sort of thing. Anyway, so yeah, this afflicts the whole field, and it could afflict this research too. I don't know enough directly to assess it.
Right. Is there I mean, that sounds quite damaging, but is there like a solid corpus of psychology knowledge, stuff that's like, okay, this is the solid stuff. We know this is correct. And then maybe there's a bunch of other stuff that's kind of shaky, and maybe it's not. Or is it just like the whole field is just contentious?
So I specialize in a very narrow area, so I wouldn't be able to point to precisely those areas that are like this is solid and this isn't. What I will say is that some of the methods used in, for instance, personality psychology, often, a lot of those are going to be, there's going to be a big focus on validation and factor analysis and various sorts of characteristics of measurement, where there's greater emphasis placed on it. And there's a lot of recycling, repetition, and reuse of the same scales and measures, like big five, over and over and over, that sort of thing. And in that case, a lot of that data is probably going to be a lot more robust. I don't think anybody seriously questions whether Big Five is picking up on something. Now, there are disputes on like what the optimal number of factors and subfactors are. So people are certainly disputing that. There's people that are like, we should go with a 2-factor model. We should go with 5, but we need to, it's more than 5. You got to go with the hexaco model, and it's actually 6. So there are disputes, but I think it would be very strange if someone were to say, yeah, openness to experience and extroversion are just not things. Now, there are problems where you get, I don't want to get too much into it, but people are constantly trying to publish novel findings, and this will often involve the construction of new, like the identification or the supposed identification of new psychological constructs, these new supposedly important variables of human psychology to measure. And some of those might just end up being previously established measures in disguise. Or they might even be this sort of chimeric stitching together of 2 or 3 other measures. You can imagine someone, I think it's too much to get into that, but I think some stuff in personality psychology is going to be more robust. It's probably the case that certain things in fields of psychology that are more closely tied to psychometric tools that have a higher degree of precision are probably going to be better. So work in cognitive psychology, I would bet a lot of work on like using like eye tracking and stuff like that. So like cognitive psychology, perception, I would bet a lot of that replicates better and is more robust, but I'm not entirely sure. However, one should also note that for some of these studies, like studies that rely on fMRI, although the methods might be more sciencey, often it's expensive, time-consuming, and difficult to gather participants. And so you might have studies with much smaller sample sizes, and it might be intractable. It's not possible to do not feasible in practice to do an fMRI with 5,000 participants. Some of those other studies in cognitive psychology, if you're doing some study where you're checking, I don't know, where people are looking at an object, or quick judgments in perceptual judgments, you can do a within subjects design for a lot of those. You could get like 50 or 100 or 1,000 measures for one person. Maybe not 1,000, but you could get a lot for one person. And then that could give you a lot more solid data than a lot of work in social psychology, which frequently uses between subjects design, meaning that, let's say I might randomly assign people to one of two conditions, and I take one measure of the people in the experimental condition, one measure of people in the control condition. I only have one measure per person instead of 50 measures per person or 10 measures per person. And in that case, you might want a larger sample size, but there is a trade-off there, which is that if you're only gathering one measure and it's something fairly straightforward, like a survey, like a response to survey question, it might be easy to do that. It's a lot harder to get 1,000 people. So like you could, with social psych, you could run a survey with 1,000 people and get that done in a day, sometimes in a few hours. But try doing 1,000 MRIs in one day. So there are going to be these methodological differences. I don't have expertise or even significant competence outside my area. So I couldn't tell you about those problems. It'd be great to get like panelists from a bunch of different areas of psychology to discuss the methodological problems they face. They're going to face a lot of similar and overlapping problems. They're going to have a lot of low-powered studies, poor replication rates, publication bias, all sorts of problems with that. But then they're also probably, in fact, I would say probably, almost certainly. In fact, I'll just say they will turn out. Why am I qualifying so much? Every one of these areas is going to have problems distinctive to that area, but there's going to be solid stuff. I'm sorry that's not a direct answer to the question, but there's going to be more and less robust literatures.
Right. So if somebody's psychologist comes up to you and he says, "Hey, I got this result from," believe me, you should take that with a grain of salt is the takeaway.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, depending on the area, the base rate for it, the effect turning out to be true might be like, it's more likely than not that it's not true, which is I think a little upsetting. That doesn't mean that the field is totally worthless though. So simply because it's difficult to find things out doesn't mean it's impossible, and doesn't mean that we don't know anything. There are probably like, if I sat down and really looked into it, there's probably some areas of research one could identify that are more robust. I should say, I think Paul Bloom just put out a book on this. Let me find it. And because I think Paul Bloom got into this, like what actually can we robustly know in psychology? I think the book is called Psych. It is. Okay, Psych, The Story of the Human Mind. I have not read this book, so I can't vouch for it, but I've heard good things. And I think it addresses this sort of question. So let me post that in the chat. And would you mind, I don't know, if you want to stick around, I could talk for a bit more, but I also want to address the comments too. Is that okay?
Yeah, of course. Go ahead.
Great. Okay. And there's not a whole lot of them. We do have another one from Majesty of Reason. Thanks for sticking around. Every time Lance says more realism, take a shot. Depending on the day and the topic, that would be dangerous. That would be too many shots. We have another one, which is from Nora Belrose. Hello. Would be interested in hearing your take on Richard Rorty's neo-pragmatism sometime. I haven't read Rorty, so I would have to go stop and read that. I'd love to hear from somebody else. There's so many things I haven't read. I spent years in the psychology of metaethics and moral psych. So many years that I could have been reading stuff other than reading and rereading the same things over and over, and like a bunch of weird papers on validity and stuff like that. Okay, let me get to some other remarks. That's interesting. Yeah, very few people that I've encountered actually share my sense that irreducible normativity is unintelligible. There are some, but not very many. All right, here's a comment on some of the recent stuff. There's often very little money in replicating studies, unfortunately, so very little incentive to do it, despite how important it is. And then I see that follow-up, hard to get grants for it. Yeah, my impression is that is very much true. If I had wanted to run replication studies, I would have been told not to. And journals are not going to want to publish them. Some journals have even had a policy, they probably still do, where they just say, we don't publish replications. A lot of journals put a premium on novelty. They want new stuff. They want, exciting findings. And there is a strangely less of an emphasis on quality and rigor in the research. I find this baffling, but I am not making that up. And I have other concerns. I do mention this sometimes, that I'm interested in meta-science. And as I'm critical of everything, I'm pretty critical of the peer review system. I don't know if people know this, but peer review, at least systematic, sort of ubiquitous peer review, has only been around for a few decades. It's very recent in academia. And I am skeptical that it's as effective as people think it is. Those are, this is something I didn't want to say until recently, but for some people, those are fighting words, and they might be very critical of me. Lance is the heretic that's skeptical of peer review? Yes, I am. I'm extremely skeptical. I think it has significant costs and downsides. I think it's also the particular way in which it's done. I don't know if people are aware of this, but if you're invited to do a peer review, at least in my areas, you're not paid. So you're doing volunteer work for publishers that do get a bunch of money, and you don't get any. So you're not getting paid. You're doing a big chunk of the work, arguably most of it. And then these typically aren't made publicly available. Often they're highly variable in their effort. A lot of people are super diligent and serious about how they do peer reviews, and other people are really critical and rude and unhelpful and dismissive and don't put a lot of time and effort into it. So you get peer reviews are all over the map. You'll see in academia, if you go online and you look at how people talk about it, it's just this, it's a whole, just, I would say it's a meme, but it's really like a bucket of memes of jokes about like reviewer two. So people get reviews like saying, the only appropriate place for this paper to get published is in a paper shredder. People nastiest comments like that. Or someone might say, I wasn't concerned about existential risks and, the possibility of Armageddon before reading this paper, but now having read it, I don't think it could come any sooner. So people will just say terrible things. They get more clever. I'm making stuff up off the top of my head. They get way more clever than that. So at least they're clever with the horrible and nasty things they say about people, but it's so unnecessary. So I've done, I don't know, how many reviews have I done? It's more than 10 and probably less than 20. And I don't say stuff like that. It does not helpful for people to say stuff like that. I've been critical, but not just been nasty for the sake of it. Anyway. Cool. I got another comment here, which is some people definitely seem to regard peer review much too highly. Yeah, I think that they do. And it is, I kind of cringe a little bit when someone goes, oh, and this paper is peer reviewed, as if the paper is somehow magical or very likely to be correct because it's peer reviewed. Even if peer review serves as a filter and has a positive effect, I very much doubt that the effect is particularly strong. But the other thing I often wonder is, how good is the peer-reviewed research on the efficacy of peer review as a method? And I suspect if we go and look, it's not going to be very impressive. But I don't know. That was a bit of a tangent, but sure.
Right. I actually didn't know that peer review was such a recent invention. And I suppose one might wonder whether or not we really need it, because just for example, so many seminal results in physics were attained without or pre-World War II. And you posted an article in your Discord that I read, and the person who wrote it seemed also quite critical of peer review and said it doesn't really seem to do much. The reviewers aren't very good at catching mistakes.
Yeah, was this the experimental history thing?
Right, yeah.
Yeah, let me post that because that got a lot of traction. Where is that post? Here it is. And there's, I think, one or two follow-up posts. So I'll put this in. I have so many things. I'm going to have to go back through the whole thing and just put all of these in the description. But this, I really like this. I do know it caused quite a lot of polarization in people's reactions. So I had a very positive reaction to this article, which is extremely critical of peer review. And some people had very negative reactions. So I could just say definitively, I side with the people that are super critical of peer review. I am extremely skeptical of its efficacy. And I see the costs of it as massive. And if you're curious about this at all, have a look at that article. And look, maybe you're not going to find it very, very persuasive. I do think that there's been a degree of status quo bias and entrenchment in the presumption that it's a good method. And I don't find that very persuasive. I find it surprising that its proponents don't seem to me to offer very good arguments for why it's good, and also don't seem to feel the need. It seems like it's treated as, by default, we must have it. And if anyone wants to argue against it, not only must they make overwhelmingly persuasive super convincing criticisms, they also have to provide us with a robust and obviously superior alternative that we should be able, it should be so obviously superior, we should be able to judge that it's better before even trying it out. So it looks like the demands for defenders of peer review, at least from my point of view, it looks to me this way. peer review, I'm going to presume that it's magical and it's almost unassailable. It's this mighty fortress. And if you want me to abandon my fortress peer review and go do something else, you have to knock down every single wall in the castle, every single wall. If you don't knock them all down, then you haven't done a good enough job. And that won't even get me to leave unless you present me a beautiful palace that's clearly even more impregnable first. And if you don't do those two things, I get to keep doing peer review. That's what it looks like. In other words, it looks like the bar is set so absurdly high that no one can ever meet it. And a lot of people addressing this will say, okay, well, we got to think of these alternatives. Why? If something is actively bad, you could just stop doing it. Like imagine someone's giving someone a medication and it turns out it doesn't work and it's going to give them horrible diseases. Well, I got to keep giving it to them unless you give me a better medication to give them. No, just stop giving it to them. So why not just stop doing peer review? But then what's going to happen? I don't know. Let's find out. Humanity's done wilder things than that before. And I think we would figure it out. So I am not one of these people that thinks that you have to provide an alternative in order to just stop doing it. So
right. I mean, if somebody were, trying to start a car, say, and I notice the engine's missing, and then I say, "Hey, man, you're not going to start the car. There's no engine." And he says, "Well, you find a car for me, otherwise I'm going to keep trying to start this one." It seems a little silly.
That's a good analogy. Yeah, that's a good comparison. Yeah, it does to me seem that way. I think, though, to be fair to the people that have this perspective, I think there's a presumption that it is effective. And what you'll hear from many people are anecdotes and stories about its effectiveness. Like, oh, when I've submitted papers, I've gotten incredible reviews and they've been really helpful. I have to say, I haven't had these horrible reviews where people call me an idiot and say that, they regret that I was born. I haven't had anything like that. Honestly, I do think maybe I would feel bad if I read it, but I don't know. I've had good peer review experiences for the most part. I sometimes haven't agreed with decisions. Obviously, I think anything I submit should be published always. And so if anybody doesn't immediately publish it and say it's the greatest thing and like they're going to personally lobby for there to be a new Nobel Prize just to give me one, that's the kind of response I want. I've never got that. I've got, yeah, fine. You've barely crossed the finish line, whatever. So I haven't personally had bad experiences with it. So this isn't coming from like my personal bitterness, which if it did, I would mention it. I do have a bitter about a whole lot of things. This is not one of them. This is just a case where it's like, why exactly is it effective? And what's the evidence for its effectiveness? And, so you're going to rely on anecdotes. Where's the peer-reviewed systematic study showing its efficacy? Maybe they're there, but I rarely see anybody appeal to like, we have this huge literature that proves that anything that's not peer, if I publish a paper on a blog, it's garbage. Everything I write is just, for in scholarly terms, just complete nonsense. I'm wrong about everything. Everything I say is stupid. But every peer-reviewed paper is magnificent and there's no mistakes and they're all super correct. There's not a literature like that.
Right. It seems like a lot of this stuff is, I don't know, just maybe it's like status quo or, people are trying to get status among other academics or maybe that explains it.
Yeah. I also think that there's a bunch of problems with it. I think it creates highly toxic incentives. This whole publish or perish thing. I mean, most of career advancement is through publication, and this creates, I think, really, really, really awful incentives for people to just churn out papers. So I also think that there's very little evidence that like high status journals are better than, not necessarily, because obviously there's like predatory journals and really, really bad and poorly run journals. And, high status journals are not going to be as bad as that, at least most of the time. But there's going to be, journals that are the next tier down that might very well be better journals. Maybe they are more diligent. They're more effective in what they do. And the top journals might attract a greater degree of novelty and thus actually have lower replication rates or lower quality because they publish exciting findings more so than they publish rigorous findings. So there's a lot of potential problems here, but this status chasing element of the publishing industry, I think, is bad for so many reasons. I don't even know where to begin. But at least one of the reasons is that I think it funnels all of our efforts and resources into a particular way of doing things. Think about philosophy. Like, look what we're doing here. We're talking about all kinds of stuff. I don't get to put this on my CV. I don't get to advance my career with this. But this is, in a certain sense, effortful and requires. I mean, it's not as effortful as writing a paper. I'm not claiming this should count towards getting a paper published in, I don't know, ethics or something. But it doesn't matter how many videos I do. None of it counts at all. It might even count against me. It's not going to help me very much. And something seems wrong about that to me.
Right. I mean, maybe people will take you less seriously or something. They'll just think, oh, this guy's a YouTuber.
They might. Although, yeah, there's that. But I don't like when people put too much stock in credentials either, which is why I don't want people to call me Dr. Bush. I don't want people to believe me because I have credentials. I want people to believe me because they hear what I say and they find it persuasive. And I do think that academia, that push for prestige and status can also, for I think understandable reasons, make people put more stock in people with credentials and publications and an established record in a field than people outside of it. And I think that this can cause people to overvalue I think people would take an argument like, and I wonder if this would be the case. If you presented an argument that you told people, maybe someone should do this study. Here's the idea of the study. You give it to a bunch of professional philosophers, maybe some philosophy grad students and philosophy undergrads, just to get a whole spread of people. And then just non-philosophers at all. So 4 groups of people. Here's what you do. You give them arguments, and then that argument is sort of bookended by a description of who presented the argument. And it either comes from an unestablished graduate student, or it comes from like a famous person in the field, or it comes from, I don't know, like just finds like a tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist weirdo person. And then give this to people. And I wonder if an argument people are told, oh, well, Derek Parfit articulated this argument, or this argument came from Hume or Kant or something, whether philosophers would take it more seriously than if it supposedly came from a graduate student. And maybe you could sell this to them by saying, this was an obscure text, and you could, I don't know, use ChatGPT to get it to write the style of Kant or something. So there might be a way of making it fairly convincing. If that sounds implausible to you, there was a recent study where they used ChatGPT to generate fake texts from Dan Dennett, like that he did not actually write. And then they sent the survey out to people that were familiar with Dan Dennett's work. And they did better than chance, but they did worse than you might expect, at actually identifying which ones Dennett really said versus which were from ChatGPT. So you could probably actually do this. And I bet people would overvalue statements from high status people and assign less truth or less evidential weight to things from low status people. What do you think?
Right. I'm not sure. I guess that would be interesting study. I guess there must be. It can't be that our faculties are just like completely unreliable. We don't. If a high status person is saying like complete nonsense, I'm not sure if we would endorse it in that case, because we do manage to like navigate our way about the world and not die. But perhaps depending on what the argument is, maybe if it's something like contentious, people would be more inclined to, nudge themselves one way or the other. But I think it would be interesting to see. Like, maybe people will just accept whatever somebody is telling them that the person is,
I agree with that. So I think if you gave a totally ridiculous argument, like, I don't know, all people are T-Rexes. No one is going to believe that. That's ridiculous. So if you give an obviously absurd argument, then I think it might not matter. People are just going to say, no, it's not, it doesn't matter who said it. And the same thing for like a really good argument. So if you give a really, really compelling argument, you said, yeah, some, undergraduate made this argument. If people go, okay, well, it's a good argument. But maybe in the middle zone, there's a bump for status and prestige. It might also be that the benefits of status and prestige in causing people to believe things doesn't really occur in these like sort of isolated, decontextualized contexts where you're reading excerpts, but they occur more in social context. So it could be that people feel a social pressure when there's an audience to like endorse an argument from Parfit or something because everybody loves Parfit. And then there's that cognitive dissonance kicks in where you just said it to be polite, but now you're like, oh, I guess I gotta, maybe there is something to it. But yeah, I do think status and prestige probably cause people to overvalue evidence. And for me, it's really more plausibly a question of how much. Maybe it's just not very much. Maybe it's a lot. I don't know.
Right. Just from what you've been telling me, it seems like the incentives in academia are set up in a really screwy way.
They are, and it's super competitive. So we churn out way more PhDs than there's jobs for. Then a lot of them are funneled through postdocs forever. It's hard to get long-term jobs. And then when you do, a lot is riding on how many publications do you get and where are you publishing. So it's not like you could just publish anywhere. You have to publish in top tier journals. And then those journals want like novelty. They want specific things. There might be a degree of gatekeeping. There's a degree of social networking involved. I don't know how much one's social connections influence one's likelihood of getting published. But I very much suspect, at the very least, some people that are able to navigate the social ins and outs of their particular fields may acquire ways of framing and discussing and pitching their work that enhance its publishability above and beyond the merits of the work. So I think there's a lot of problems going on. And that's not even getting into grants and problems with getting grant money. This might be less of a problem for philosophy than psychology, but it's probably a problem everywhere.
Right. I just dimly recall that I did remember reading something that people are like, after somebody wins a Nobel Prize, people are like more likely to cite their work. Do you happen to know anything about that? I dimly recall reading it.
Yeah, only very vaguely. I have heard that even after research has been studies that have failed to replicate, and I think even in cases when studies have been retracted. So you're familiar with retraction of a paper?
Is that when they say this is just all hokey and they just take it out?
It's unpublishing the paper. Oh. It's like officially unpublishing it. So if a paper's published and then it's retracted, it means for some reason, this paper, we're not going to publish it. Often that is due to fraud. So the people like fake the data or something like that, but it could be for other reasons. And so even in those cases, people continue to cite it more or less at the same rate. Then you might think, okay, well, people are citing failures to replicate or retracted papers just to mention, oh yeah, this study didn't replicate, and then they cite it. Nope, someone went and looked, and people are still citing it as if it's true anyway. I mean, the situation in academia is really, really bad. We have a huge problem. And honestly, I've done this and I've done it quite frequently, is cite papers without, I don't thoroughly read every paper I've cited. A lot of times it's like, well, I say this is true, so let me go find a study that says that it's true, and then I'll cite it. I've done this before. And if I don't look carefully, I can miscite things. Now, something that I've done on research collaborations is we have gone through and checked the citations and then actually looked in the paper, and we've set standards. We have to identify a quote where if we said the article says this, we need to find a quote in the paper that says it explicitly. So we've done stuff like that, but you can still make mistakes. It's just that the scholarship is not as strong as it could be. And again, that might not have been as much of an issue if people had room to breathe. But if you don't get 8 publications this year, you're going to sink. Okay, so you're going to stop and do the scholarship to read all those papers thoroughly? No one's going to care. You're not going to get rewarded. What you're rewarded for is getting your paper in a top journal. You're not rewarded directly for good scholarship.
Right. So it's like when you're in high school or something, and you just look on Wikipedia for something, and then you find an official sort of source, and then you say, "Oh, I got it from here." That stuff never ends, more or less.
It never ends. That is ongoing in both philosophy and psychology, and I would be shocked if it wasn't going on in other fields. So. Yeah, academia has all kinds of problems. I haven't talked about this on my channel before. So this is I guess one of the advantages of feeling like I've got stuff behind me is I can be more critical of academia. I'm not critical because I hate it or I think it's totally broken. But I think that there are huge problems, and I don't think there's a will to address them. I think that it's just become so competitive that people don't want to step out of the competition to scrutinize the competition itself, because that costs you in the competition. I mean, imagine you're in a race. So imagine you suddenly became conscious in the middle of a race
And if you don't start getting ahead of people, like every person you get ahead, you get paid more. Every person you fall behind, you get paid less. And if you fall behind too many people, you're kicked out entirely. Okay, now you're in the middle of that. And are you going to stop and think, should we be racing this way? No, because then you fall behind. You have to focus on the race. So it sucks that the only people that know about and care about the topic well enough to do the critical work are the ones in the race. And so anyone that wants to try to adequately address it in an informed way is almost invariably going to pay a massive cost to do so. And it's unavoidable. And that sucks. So we have this system where we have messed up incentives. And then that system is almost unfixable because it sort of is protecting itself by dragging everyone into it. And then they have to pay a cost to get out. It's awful. This is awful. Look at me. When I started my PhD, I did not have all this gray. Now I got it. I don't think it's just aging.
Yeah. Do you happen to know if the problem is worse in other fields, worse in certain fields than in others? So
probably, but I really don't know. I don't know enough about other fields. There's people that probably are working on this. I keep saying probably, but yeah, it seems, so I just got through with a psychology program. So I haven't been in a philosophy department directly for quite a few years. And I was never in a philosophy PhD program. But my guess is that philosophy programs would be a little worse than psychology programs. And I would also guess that at least one factor is that the more job positions there are, probably generally the better. So in certain academic fields, if people feel that there's greater hope at getting a serious job, that takes a lot of the strain off. But there's got to be other factors, because there's going to be cultural factors, discipline, grant related, like monetary factors. There's going to be a whole bunch of factors. And so this is going to be a multifactorial thing. And like, I don't know what funding looks like if you're a scholar in chemistry, because chemistry, I don't know what proportion go into private industry, but maybe that's an option. If you're a professional philosopher, what's the private industry for philosophy? I mean, I saw this meme that a kid says to their dad, like, "Hey, I've decided to major in philosophy," and then the father is like, "Oh, that's great, because they just opened up a philosophy factory down the street." So I enjoyed that, because I mean, people do question the value of these degrees. People often tout them too, because like a bachelor's degrees, you get a philosophy degree, you go work in an office, it doesn't matter. But for PhDs, it does matter. If you have a PhD in philosophy, you probably don't want to, do something too far from philosophy. So yeah, but the short answer, I don't know.
Right. Well, I suppose on an optimistic note, it's not like academia doesn't make any progress, right? I mean, we do know stuff, and universities do. Well, although even then, I guess I'd have to brush up on my history, because it could be that a lot of the results from natural sciences are just the result of like independent scholars, and like this whole sort of the whole sort of way research is conducted today might also just be a recent sort of parochial invention.
Yeah, my guess is that we will find that the widespread implementation of the peer review system, and this is just a very loose hypothesis, I suspect that it's been a major factor in driving down innovation and progress in academia in general. I think that it serves largely as a gatekeeping mechanism, and I think also that it's undermining interdisciplinary research. I think and it's not just the peer review system, it's the producing, basically, if you create this incentive system where everybody has to everybody has to do a PhD, they all have to be novel, everyone has to specialize, and so you get people that are splitting the atoms within hairs to do something a little different, and then you get this just glut of people with all these specializations, and that has created, you can imagine a branching system where if you're in the middle, you're a sort of polymath and you do everything, but people branch and branch and branch and branch until all the branches are so far from one another, nobody could talk to each other anymore. They're all on like, it's like everybody, it's like, imagine one big population, but then they live on smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller islands, and then you keep them apart for decades and decades and decades, and they develop their own languages and they can't talk anymore. And I think that that's a problem in academia more generally, is that one would have hoped that giving everybody an education, which is amazing, well, not everybody,
there's been a big uptick in access to education. Certainly, there's room for a lot more progress, but that increase has had huge benefits and advantages. But for individuals, for society, whatever. But there are also some costs, and one of these costs, I think, of hyper specialization is the lack of you could say like a synthetic, synthesis and cross disciplinary communication. I think it's a big cost.
Right. I suppose one comment on education is, I'm not. I'm just as an aside. I am skeptical of the value of education, and that just has to do with. It seems that most of what I learned in school, and I think it would be nice to do some more systematic study on this, but it seems that most of what I learned in school was, just not useful. And then you might say, well, it'll. I don't know, it'll enhance your life in such and such ways. And I don't know, I'm just very skeptical of that because it doesn't seem like anyone presented any sort of evidence for that apart from just asserting it. For a lot of subjects, I don't even remember what I learned. And moreover, it just seems that in the fields that I do know stuff about, I know stuff because I'm just interested in the field and I study it. And it's unclear to me how much a formal education really helps at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, have you read or heard about Brian Kaplan's book, The Case Against Education?
I have heard of the book, but I haven't read it.
Yeah, give it a look. So Kaplan makes a sustained case. I think the primary focus is on undergraduate college education. I don't know if it's like localized to the United States, but generally speaking, the argument is that most of the value of these degrees comes from signaling pre-existing qualities that people that happen to be able to get into the programs and obtain the degrees had, and that the degrees aren't conferring the qualities on them so much as sort of rubber stamping that they already had those characteristics. And so the idea there is that higher education is, at least at the undergraduate level, isn't doing a whole lot for people. There are arguably caveats and qualifiers that more practical and applied fields do a better job of conferring relevant domain skills than, say, a more general liberal arts education. So that book is out there. That book has made that sort of case. I don't know that tells us a whole lot about grade school or graduate training. It's hard to judge. So, I mean, that's one book. I don't know if, what criticisms of that book look like, or whether they make, maybe there are solid criticisms. I can say a few things, though, which is that some of my courses seemed like, to me, like they had a huge impact on me. I took a few philosophy courses with an instructor that was really good at pushing us to write high quality homework assignments and good essays and give a lot of really critical feedback. That seemed valuable. There were other classes that seemed to me to inspire me and instill a lifelong love of particular topics and expose me to things that I probably wouldn't have been exposed to. Certain classes that had more of an applied angle really seemed to help. So it looks like I got something out of that. It might be that it's hard to measure the benefits of certain types of education. And so certain types of standardized tests or ways of measuring it just don't pick up on the changes that people obtain. So, I mean, there's a lot of room for skepticism here. I am open, certainly, to criticisms of education more generally. I think it would be weird not to be, and I'm certainly not going to be defensive about education. So I think criticism of education is only to the good. And the reason for that isn't, if there are better ways to educate people, shouldn't we find out what they are and implement them? I do find it weird because I see education in large part as a science. It's an empirical question. What ways are better and worse for teaching people things? And I'm sure there's a ton of work on this, but it feels like a lot of education seems to have this inertia in the way that it's structured and designed, and everything just seems to be that people go, this is how you educate people. And it doesn't seem like we're constantly updating our approach to education in light of the best available science. It seems like that to me, but I don't really know. I don't study this.
I don't know if grade schools are different now than they were when I was a kid. I don't know. I haven't studied it. But my guess is that science is and empirical findings are only playing a loose role and probably an inadequate role. And I'm not faulting educational researchers. I'm saying people probably aren't taking that research and implementing it as seriously as they should. So it's, if all the nutrition scientists in the world find out all this great stuff about nutrition, but nobody cares that nobody's changing their diets.
Yeah,
that's it's not a problem with the nutrition science. It's a problem with like implementation and social policy. So I'm not pointing a finger at any particular problem. I'm saying my general impression is, to the extent that education isn't as good as it could be, I find it puzzling that there isn't greater effort in doing so, like improving it.
Right.
Any general thoughts on all that?
Right. So, yeah, I think this. I think it would be interesting to implement sort of education research and actually teaching people. I do know that apparently spaced repetition is supposed to be helpful. But I suppose if you think of it as signaling, right, and it's not really all that surprising, you could have people just do the most pointless thing in the world and, just whatever cognitively demanding task over time to, sort of measure how conscientious they are. And because you just want to sort out or weed out the intelligent, diligent people. And if that's all education is there for, I suppose it's actually not surprising at all that it's structured the way it is.
I mean, I hope it's not that way, but if it is, something's got to be done. I don't think I'm the person to fix that. My personal thing, I don't know what to call it, is all about problems I perceive to be in academic philosophy, and I don't think that impinges much on undergraduate or primary education. It's more of a higher education sort of thing at best, but it's actually really even after that. It's like once you get into the field, I see all the problems mostly occurring there. So,
right. You mentioned you went to Tufts. Did you ever take any classes with Dennett?
Took a bunch of classes at Dennett. I took Foundations of Cognitive Science. That was one of the, I think it was called Philosophical Foundations of Cognitive Science. That was the first course I took with him. Then there was a course on, what was the course called? Some course on cultural evolution. We read, I think we read Kim Sorelny's book, The Evolved Apprentice, although that may have been for a different class. And then we read Not by Genes Alone, I think. So it was a book. It was a course on cultural evolution. So that was super cool. But I also had an awesome opportunity. So while I was there, I was really interested in experimental philosophy and meta philosophy, but there were no courses on it. So I asked a friend of mine who was in the program. I was like, "Hey, do you think we should ask Professor Dennett if he would oversee an independent study on this?" And he was like, "Yeah, why not?" So I put together a syllabus, and he worked with me on that syllabus. We basically created our own course and pitched the idea to him. And he was like, "Yeah, sure. I wanted to read this stuff anyway." So we ended up doing that course, and it was great. So I did an independent study with Professor Dennett, and that was super cool. And I think the course is called, I can't find my syllabus that we've created for it. It's called Intuitions and Philosophical Methodology, I think was the name of it. I don't remember everything that we read in there, but I thought it was a fantastic experience. And then so it was, I think 3 of us ended up with the independent study, and then we met with him and we would go over the readings and everything. It was an awesome experience. It was super, super cool. So yeah, I got to do course with them. It was really great. There might have been another course in there, but I can't remember.
Right. That sounds like something, I guess I read his book, Consciousness Explained. And it does seem like in the book, from what I remember, he does seem quite at least somewhat skeptical of this intuition-based methodology. So I guess it does seem like something he'd be interested in.
Oh yeah, he was definitely interested in the topic. And it was just super cool. I don't know. I don't have a rich enough set of anecdotes and experiences from that, I guess you could call it a course, to draw on, but it was certainly very formative.
Right. I suppose that's actually segueing to another, issue I have with philosophy is this reliance on, although I suppose it's not really a natural kind, intuition. And I think that this actually ties back into what you said about expertise, where we don't know that philosophers' intuitions are especially probative. And yeah, I don't want to be polemic, but it's unclear to me how philosophical intuitions are any more probative than, say, tea leaf reading or numerology.
Yeah, so some philosophers are going to say that intuitions are nothing special. They're just judgments, and people that have really dedicated themselves to thinking about a particular topic in a rigorous, systematic, and thoughtful way are going to generally think about it better than people who haven't. And so philosophers they're not acquiring a special ability. It's not like everybody else is just a regular person and then they, drink a special potion and now they have magic powers. It's not like their intuitions are of a qualitatively distinct kind. It's rather that they've just sort of sharpened the toolkit that everybody's already using all the time for the judgments that they have. And everybody has intuitions. We use intuitions for everything. And so that's one approach that they could take. I think this is closer to the Williamson approach to characterizing intuitions, that they're, philosophy doesn't have this special methodology. It's continuous with our ordinary ways of thinking. I think that's a more defensible way of characterizing it. So I don't know what you make of that type of response. I'm steel manning the view because I'm very critical of intuitions, but that's something someone could say.
Right. So one thing would be that even granting that, so first of all, it seems that they're actually making a lot of claims that seem to bleed into cognitive science. Because if they want to say something like, what is happening when people are making judgments of philosophical matters, right? So like in method of cases, if they want to say that's the same thing as somebody say, I don't know, let's say what an engineer does when he solves some engineering problem, right? That seems to me a claim of cognitive science and neuroscience. But I suppose just even granting that, right? It could be that, so I actually had this discussion with someone. I said, well, I'm skeptical of thought experiments, right? And he said, he brought up Einstein's thought experiments. And then I didn't say this. We moved on to some other topic, but I wanted to say, well, I said, well, one thing to say is that these are typically not evidence for a claim. They're used as pedagogical tools. But another thing is that physics has this sort of validation that sort of philosophy doesn't. So even granting, say, Williamson's claim that the same thing is happening, well, then I could just say, okay, but our intuitions about physics and natural science and everything, those are probative because we can know by experiment. And then these philosophical intuitions are just mysterious and there's no reason to take them seriously. Even granting that first claim.
Notice you're doing something similar to what I said earlier about why I take expertise in the sciences more seriously, because there's a sort of external means of corroboration. The world itself, you could check their expertise against the world itself. And it's the same thing in this case. Einstein or Galileo or somebody can have a thought experiment. It's like, okay, well, we can now test that. If someone thinks up, if you drop this and that in a vacuum, it's going to be this way. And, I think there's one of the two objects tied together.
Right. I get it.
Sure. Okay. But then we could actually go out and do that and find out. I don't know how you would test. Okay. So most philosophers agree it's okay to pull the switch in the switch case in the trolley problem. Okay. And do we go pull some switches and let some trains run some people over? And then there's a way of, okay, the correctness particles fall out of it. There's nothing happens to confirm it. So there's no means of corroborating it in the world. It's just, well, we agree on it. So that good enough for us. I think that that's a serious problem, is that a lot of their intuitions sort of quantify over instances in which there is no external means of corroboration, not just in practice, but in principle. And philosophers just go, sure, but that's just, we deal with the stuff that doesn't have these external means of corroboration. We're not doing a science. We don't want to do a science. What we're doing isn't continuous with the sciences. It's special. It's sui generis. It's its own thing. Leave it alone. And don't touch it because it's special.
That's how it seems to me a lot of this is operating. I don't have a problem with intuitions in and of themselves, especially if one's construing them as judgments, but I want those intuitions to function and operate within a broader network of judgments and assessments that figure into, for instance, inference to the best explanation, or developing models that have, even if the intuition itself doesn't directly result in some experiment or prediction or something like that, the intuition could be about something that is externally capable of external corroboration. I want these intuitions to play a role in our best scientific models of the world. And I don't see philosophy as giving us any useful insight if its proponents are going to characterize portions of it as totally partitioned off from the sciences. So that is what I'm going to be against. I'm going to be against this sort of autonomous philosophy and this like special magical intuition power. And those are not charitable ways of characterizing what they're doing, but then they're not super charitable ways of characterizing it. If someone wants to say you really need to characterize this more respectfully, maybe I'll do that. I will note that the favor is rarely returned. That doesn't mean that it's okay to always, respond in kind, but I have not seen, philosophers are just love to say to anybody that, I'm not saying all philosophers do this or anything, but this is common enough among philosophers. You've heard this term scientism.
I have heard that.
Yeah. And so I see a lot of philosophers, if anybody's super critical of philosophy and is pro-science, like, you're scientistic. You think it's all about science. And it's like, well, no, but mostly, they are the ones that are like curing diseases and landing people on the moon, allegedly. No, they are. Wait, YouTube.
No, don't get into that.
Moon landing's real. Oh no, is this video going to get flagged now?
No.
That would just be funny. I don't care. Oh no, I have to worry about that. So, damn it. Why did I have to mess up like that? So, there's, what was I even talking about? That made me lose my train of thought. I have to worry because I'm on the channel now.
It's all about science. No, but not really.
Oh, right. Yeah, the scientific objection. Yeah, philosophers are always, I have to be careful. Many philosophers, I think, have an overly critical attitude towards people that are very pro-science. And if someone has an anti-philosophy attitude, they don't seem to respond with, okay, fair enough. We did it first. So whatever.
Right. I suppose, I don't know. I want to resist making strong metaphysical claims, mainly because I think metaphysics is nonsense. But it seems to me that, I'm not getting into an argument about, well, this is the way things really are, whatever that whole discourse means. If you sort of do all these theories in physics, say, right, you make a prediction, or, for example, you can, you build a radio or something and the radio works, right? So it seems to me there would just be a pragmatic argument, if nothing else, for just taking what natural science says seriously.
That's certainly my approach. So, I ran into someone maybe a year or two ago now. I think it's been a couple of years, where I was expressing my views about stuff. We got talking about all sorts of things, and they're like, "Oh, so you're like a pragmatist?" And my reaction was, "I don't think so." And they were pragmatists, so they were laying out this sort of pragmatist framework, and they're a big fan of William James, and also someone that's a little more obscure that I'll get to in a second. But it looked like their characterization, it looked like my natural disposition to do things that way. Now, that isn't to say that I reinvented pragmatism. It's probably just that I've had influences from philosophers and I have poor retention and a bad memory and don't realize that I've already been influenced by this stuff from lectures and exposure to certain sorts of things. At least one I could remember is Stitch and Fragmentation of Reason and some of Stephen Stitch's work, which has this pragmatist element to it, although not pragmatist in quite the same respect, at least as far as I could tell, as James or Dewey or some early pragmatists. But in particular, I had exposure to this person called FCS Schiller. Have you ever heard of Schiller?
You mentioned him before.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I guess you've already heard this before. So what this person has been doing, because they're doing work on Schiller,
is they will just get excerpts of Schiller's work and send it to me. And I'm like, I could have wrote that. I mean, it's usually written better than my writing, and it's a little more caustic than I am, but it's expressing similar sentiments, and it's often framed in the same way. So, like, just to give one example of the uncanny overlap is I encountered that exchange. I don't even remember how, but it's like Alice in Through the Looking Glass, and she comes across Humpty Dumpty. And Humpty Dumpty just starts using words in slightly weird ways. And she's challenging him on this. And then Humpty Dumpty responds by saying, well, you know, something like this. I'm paraphrasing. I don't remember exactly verbatim. If it's verbatim, it's by accident. It's something like, you know, words mean exactly what I want them to say, nothing more, nothing less, something like that. And so I was like, that's my view of language. So I was like, I have the Humpty Dumpty view of language. And I think it turns out Schiller or James or one of these pragmatists, I think it was Schiller, might have been somebody else, expressed a similar view. Like, yeah, Lewis Carroll's characterization of language, that's right. It's the Humpty Dumpty view of language. So like we drew on the same literature for these views. Maybe that's not too surprising because we're similar cultural backgrounds. But yeah, and then a lot of Schiller's objections to formal logic and the way people goof around with language, a lot of it actually looks to me, again, not a scholar on this stuff, there are similarities to things that Wittgenstein raised and ordinary language philosophers raised. And this was stuff that was several decades before that. So it's really, really cool. So there's been this current of critical perspectives on mainstream analytic philosophy pretty much for, you know, well over a century now, you know, kind of, you know, for a long time. And I just, every time I encounter these views, I'm like, yeah. So yeah, I do. Sorry, that was a long way of saying pragmatism is going to get a thumbs up for me.
Right. Yeah, I've heard you mention James and Schiller before. I should really check out some of their writings.
But nobody knows about Schiller, and a lot of these, you know, the person that's working on this stuff, they often have to get like special copies of the books because, you know, it's stuff that's not scanned. You're not going to get audiobooks of it. You're not going to get easy access to Schiller's work. Schiller has been largely forgotten, despite being, as far as I understand, rather influential and prominent at the time. At the start of James's pragmatism, it says something like right on like the first page that's like, if you want a good overview of pragmatism, go read Schiller. And Schiller's referenced, I think, a couple dozen times, maybe more, in pragmatism itself. So Schiller seems to have been important at the time. Apparently, Schiller was not very friendly, so people didn't like Schiller, and that seems to have led possibly to some of the sort of a ignoring of Schiller's work. But I also suspect that something funny is going on with the history of philosophy, because I would bet, I haven't studied much history of philosophy, especially not, you know, I didn't do any graduate training specifically for that purpose, that there's all sorts of philosophers that were brilliant and their works have been forgotten and haven't been appreciated as much as they should be. That's the case. I think so much of philosophy is certain people are prominent and become fashionable for reasons totally unrelated to the quality of their work, which isn't to say the work is bad. It could just be 5 people are excellent and everybody focuses on one for no obvious reason.
Right. So, I mean, even there are, I think, famous figures who have been critical of at least large areas of philosophy. For example, I think David Hume said that a lot of like metaphysics was just sophistry
and the positivists and yeah, I mean, there's been a bunch of them. I wanted to mention this comment here. So someone says semantics just is pragmatics, as I always like to say. Yeah, so something I'm taken to saying is it's pragmatics all the way down. And there I'm drawing on that, you know, this what's the earth on top? It's on top of the turtle. What's under the turtle? It's turtles all the way down. Yeah, I think language is totally context driven. And the slogan I tend to use is words don't mean things, people mean things. I did recently run into someone saying that a characterization of language is like this game, that it's more externalized to the community. And I guess in that sense, you could see it more as sort of socially constructed and interdependent with different speakers. I'm sympathetic to that too. But I also, you know, in any given instance, what I mean is precisely what I intend to mean by it. That doesn't mean words can't reference things outside of like mental states that I have. So if I say, you know, whoever stole this is going to get arrested. And so in that case, like I'm referencing someone and I don't even know who it is, but like, right. I don't think my words are like magically, it's not like sparkles float out and find that person in a time. But, and I don't think philosophers really think that. So again, I'm caricaturing a little bit, but we should be able to have a bit of fun without being nasty to people, hopefully. Right. But yeah, so I'm aware that language has those funny features. If I, imagine you come onto you come home and like someone broke into the safe in your house and stole all your documents. You could say, whoever stole this, you're referencing someone and you don't even know who it is. So it can't be part of your internal mental states, who the person is, because you don't know. But I still don't think that like words have intrinsic meaning. And I often find that characterization really weird. Sorry, I just wanted to address that because I thought that was cool.
Right. Yeah, I guess if somebody asked me, to construe meaning, I would just say, well, it's just the use conditions or how the word's used, or so I guess that's I'm not really sure what else it would be. Like, it's intrinsic meaning stuff. I don't know. That seems really quite suspicious to me.
I don't know really what's going on. I really want to talk to more people in philosophy of language that have a better sense of this, because I'm just a total amateur with that topic. Oh, we got another comment here, if you don't mind.
Right.
I'm already putting it up, so even if you did mind, it'd be too late. How I think of it more specifically is that meaning is determined by something like the role that certain words, phrases, propositions play in our discourse. Yeah, okay, so that sounds similar to the other thing that I was characterizing. This is an area where I have a lot to learn on this, but I kind of know more about what I don't accept than what I do. So, and this seems to be very much in line with the characterization of language in the language game. I mean, it's right in the title. And I think even the book starts with a quote from Wittgenstein. So yeah, I think that this view is starting to gain traction. And my general impression is that Chomsky and universal grammar kind of had this sweeping effect on linguistics and, by extension, large elements of philosophy for many, many decades. And hopefully that's starting to retreat in accordance with, better models of language these days. So, I do have an interest in that stuff, but it's not something I've had enough formal study to really get into. But you had initially brought up intuitions, and I got us way sidetracked. Did you have more to say about intuition?
Right. So I suppose one thing is what exactly is this universal grammar stuff?
Oh, I don't think I would be up for giving, because we're 3 hours into this, and I would already not do a good job if I was talking fresh. But right now, I would totally fumble it. So I'm not going to get too much into that. So let's do it.
Right. Of course. I suppose I wanted to say one more thing. So the philosopher Mike Humer often will defend the use of intuitions by saying that, any sort of attack on intuitions is going to itself use intuitions. So an attack on intuitions is self-defeating. Right. So one thing to notice, there seems to be something sort of screwy about these self-defeating objections. And it could be that, like, if you dig deep enough, it's just a premise that they're based on premises that your interlocutor is just not going to accept. But do you have any thoughts on that? I suppose what I would just say is that it seems to me, I'd like to get your thoughts on it.
So I have problems with self-defeat arguments. Just as a more general point, I think philosophers are often drawn to making points that sound clever, neat, convenient, or simple. So if you could say this position is self-refuting, that seems super damning. And so, like, hey, if you could show that the person's own position, it's like the person, it's stop hitting yourself, as a view. Actually, let me make a more general point, and if I get too far afield, please bring me back. One thing I often wonder is this. So I hold this view that certain positions in non-naturalist realist accounts are unintelligible. And then people will say, it's ridiculous for you to think all these philosophers are so confused they don't even know what they're saying. And they're saying non-propositional things that they think are propositional. They're all confused. Okay, but what's the alternative? So the alternative, let's say I'm an error theorist and I think realists are just wrong, but they're not conceptually confused. Okay, so they totally are getting it and then they're wrong anyway. So philosophers will make these arguments like other people's positions are self-defeating. I don't think that means that they must think those people are just totally stupid, but
So just like I don't think if philosophers are conceptually confused and are saying non-propositional things they mistakenly think are propositional, I don't think of that as like a derisive, nasty, terrible thing for me to, they're all incompetent. I don't think that at all. I think that people are steeped into various methods and traditions, and they can make deep and serious mistakes. I don't see it as substantially different from someone being taught from the time they were an undergrad in physics, this is the correct model, this is the correct model, this is the correct way to test things. And then they do that their whole career, and things mostly work, or seem to work. It turns out they're wrong, and they're actually using a poor tool or had a bad assumption, where the mistake is very far removed from that person's own direct culpability or even accessibility. That is how I see the problem that I'm attributing to that many philosophers when I say these views are unintelligible. I don't think that they're making any obvious or easy mistake to notice. And yet, if you are operating within the tradition, do you think your colleagues are just boneheads that just can't think straight? Like what is the alternative? I mean, if anything, that seems way more insulting. Oh no, you totally get what you're talking about, and then you're wrong anyway. Okay, so imagine two historians are disputing like when Caesar crossed the Rubicon or something. And then one is saying, hey, I think you're misunderstanding which river we're talking about. It's actually this one. The names of the rivers were changed, and maybe you didn't know that. And then the person might go, that's insulting. Like, I know all about when river names were changed. But imagine someone just going, oh, no, you know which river it is. You're just so bad at history, you forgot the date. Like what? Or forgot the location. I mean, how is telling someone they're wrong any less derisive than telling them they're confused? Anyway, but these self-defeat arguments, they have that kind of quality where if my argument was so obviously one that committed me to refuting myself, don't you think I'd notice? Or do you think I'm that dumb?
Right.
So when people tell me if there's something like arrogant or presumptuous about saying the whole field is wrong, I do have to wonder about whether it's arrogant or presumptuous for people within the field to think that their colleagues are making such obviously self-refuting arguments. That does puzzle me. The other thing about these self-refuting arguments is something I call the halfway fallacy. And this is where people will think that, like, for instance, people will say stuff like this. If you're a moral anti-realist, you don't think ethics is real, or you think nothing really matters. And that's really weird because it's like, hold up. I reject that there are stance-independent moral facts, but I also reject that that's the only acceptable characterization of like real ethics. So I reject both. But the proponents of these views will say, look, there is only one acceptable conception of ethics, the realist conception. You can reject it, but in that case, you don't have any ethics at all. You can only accept mine. Who says? You're the boss of ethics now? No, I can both reject your position and reject that it's the only viable position, and I can endorse this position over here. You don't own ethics. And yet philosophers will often posture as though their conception of things is the only legitimate conception, and then it's either true or false. Take it or leave it. It's weird. So this is relevant to the self-defeat things because in a lot of cases, the self-defeat arguments, so take a self-defeat of, and this is pretty similar in some ways to Strumer, which is what this motivated the sort of main topic for today, which I barely talked about, but whatever. I always do that. So people will say things like a sort of global error theory is self-defeating for Strumerian reasons, you could say, or because you don't have any reason to believe it, you don't have any justification for believing it, or that sort of thing. Okay, but I can also reject your standards and conditions for what counts as justified or what counts as a reason. I don't have to accept those. So I think there's a problem with self-defeat arguments when they presuppose it's like you look, if you want to endorse this view, but then you're self-defeating with respect to these standards. Well, what if I reject your standards? Now what? And I don't think there's a good reply from those arguments. So I don't think my anti-realist view is self-defeating because I reject the view that I need stance-independent normative reasons to endorse the view. And that if it's not, it's self-defeating. I mean, and then what are they going to do? Just stipulate, well, by self-defeating, I mean you don't believe that there's, realist epistemic facts that ground your belief? Well, of course I don't believe there's realist epistemic facts that ground the belief. But I also reject that as a necessary condition. So too bad. So I guess that would be my reply to that. With respect to intuitions in particular, so I guess I'll keep zooming in. I'm not too worried about Hume saying, well, we all have to rely on intuitions. Let's just grant that that's true for the sake of argument. Someone might be able to argue against that, and I'm open to those arguments. But I tend in this case to, because normally I have this sort of, I reject everything and I won't give any ground at all. It's give no ground kind of strategy. In this case, I'm happy to give ground. I don't know why. That's just dialectically where I've opted to go with this. Maybe I should consider some give no ground approaches. So I tend to make this
distinction between approaches where you give no ground to an argument and then you just say, no, I'm going to reject everything, and ones where you concede as much as you reasonably could and then see if you still have to accept it, given the rest of your standards and commitments. In this case, I'm happy to grant, okay, sure, maybe we do need we all need intuitions. But the mere fact that we need intuitions doesn't mean that we need any particular intuitions. So like if you need a particular instrument in order to test some model in physics, someone can't go, well, you need instruments to test models in physics, therefore you have to accept this instrument. No, I don't. So just because we need intuitions doesn't mean I need to accept that this particular intuition that you have is efficacious or likely to be true. But I don't know if humor specifically says this, but people will say stuff like intuitions are generally reliable, so any particular intuition is likely to be reliable. Well, hold on. It's not like you just pull intuitions out of a bag and 80% of the intuitions are true. And so if I just go get a random intuition, there's an 80% chance that it's true. No, intuitions are generated by brains. These brains cognitively, whatever's going on here, I don't know. It's a black box. There could be 50 different systems, 1,000 different systems, 1,000,000 different systems. And the outputs of some of those systems might have an 80% accuracy rate. The others might have a 99%. Another might have a 2%. Another might have a 0%. Maybe it's never aligned with the truth. Which system is in place when humor, for instance, reports a realist intuition? Which one? So sure, okay, my intuitions about my perceptual judgments, let's say I trust those. Why does that generalize to my intuitions about moral judgments? I don't think there's a good answer to that. So, or at least the answer would be an empirical one, or partially empirical. So my concern with someone saying, everyone has to use intuitions, is that they're leaping from, at least, I'm not saying humor is doing this, although humor might do this, but I've seen other people do this, which is that they generalize from the fact that some intuitions are reliable to the presumption that other intuitions are reliable, as though one can sort of statistically quantify over the whole set of intuitions as though they were a single homogeneous category. And whether or not they are strikes me as an empirical question. And I don't think people are entitled to presume that because some subset of intuitions are reliable, therefore some other subset are equally reliable.
Right. So I suppose it would be like saying, if I were to say, it's sort of like saying vision is reliable. But, if you really think about it, okay, well, vision and you got to specify, right? Vision when it's sunny outside, the weather's clear, it's not dark, not raining, and you can't just say, well, look, in, these sorts of conditions, our vision is reliable, we can trust it. You can't just use that to say, okay, well, we can always tell what's going on with vision. Like if I'm in just this pitch black room, I can just sort of see what's going on. And it would depend on sort of the specifics of the situation.
Yes, but a lot of philosophers might respond to that by saying, look, most perceptual judgments, the kinds that we would be inclined to accord credence to, typically occur under precisely the type of ordinary light conditions in which they are generally reliable. And when they're not, we have enough experience and familiarity to know when they're not. I'm not going to trust my judgments about whether there's a person sitting, if I'm standing in the middle of the day, I'm had a good night's sleep and there's a person standing 10 feet from me in broad daylight. Yeah, okay, I could judge there's a person there. But if it's the middle of the night and it's very dark and I'm very groggy and I just woke up and I see shadows, I don't trust my judgment that there's a person there. Oh, is there a person? And then I'm going to scrutinize. I don't have to scrutinize a person in normal light conditions. So they might say, look, you're identifying cases where we know when our judgments are and aren't reliable. But we also know that these judgments are generally reliable. We also have theoretical reasons to think judgments are generally reliable. If they weren't, there would be all sorts of problems that we might encounter. Now, maybe this is a little different for a priori judgments that don't have this practical perceptual element to them. But whatever, that's a separate issue. What they might say is, look, the key factor here is that if you want to argue that there are instances in which our perception isn't reliable, the onus is on you to identify those instances. And the same, this sort of translates over to my philosophical intuitions. I'm going to presume, like all my other intuitions, that they're generally reliable. If you want to make a case that they're not reliable in any particular instance, go ahead, and I'll be receptive to that. If you want to show that some screwed up cognitive mechanism is causing me to have unreliable judgments in a domain, do it. And, this is why you get stuff like evolutionary debunking arguments. You get Josh Green's dual process model, which argues that deontological judgments are uniquely
vulnerable to certain sorts of debunking considerations, biasing influences. Go ahead and do that. But that's your job, not my job. I get to, in other words, it's like, you could call it, I mean, it's similar to phenomenal conservatism, but you could call it like intuitive conservatism, that one is justified in believing the outputs of their intuitions in the absence of defeaters. You got to get the defeaters.
Right. So I guess one thing I would say is, so like, how people would say, like, I remember people would say, like, okay, if you're arguing with some Christian, right, the burden of proof is on the Christian to prove that God exists. And you can just stand there, right? But it's like, I don't know what they mean, because the Christian can just like, walk away, right? So it's not like there's, I would reject any sort of like, what do they mean? I have to like prove that, but presumably what they're saying is, okay, well, if you want me to stop using my intuitions, you have to convince me that they're unreliable. And we could construe it that way and just think of it like that. And then, so one thing is, I would actually say that there is evidence that philosophical intuitions are unreliable, which would just be, now this isn't like 100% probative, but the sheer amount of disagreement in philosophy. Now that wouldn't be 100% probative, right? Because of course, in cases of disagreement, there could still be a right answer. But presumably people wouldn't just disagree on visual judgments in clear conditions. So that would at least put some pressure on this idea that philosophical intuitions are generally reliable. But then another thing I could just say is, okay, well, there would just be pragmatic reasons for taking stuff like visual judgments and auditory judgments seriously. That is, if I stopped taking them seriously, I would just like die, I guess. But if I were just a quietist about the entirety of philosophy and just went about my life without living it, nothing would really happen, I guess. So there may be just purely pragmatic considerations for taking the outputs of certain cognitive systems seriously that there just aren't in philosophy.
Yeah, some of them are just not going to get on board with that. They're going to see it as like question begging or presupposing that their methods aren't reliable from the outset, that sort of thing. They could just not accept. They could say, look, I have a priori intuitions. I think they're reliable. I have good reason to think they're reliable. You haven't presented a feeder, so I get to assume that I'm accessing the truth in some way, unless you've got some way to show otherwise. And these pragmatic considerations, I don't think those are sufficient.
Right.
So a lot of people might just say, look, I'm interested in truth. I don't care if the truth is useful.
Right. Okay. Well, one other thing you could just say is, right. So I'm not sure about this, but a lot of these sort of, so it could be that just, sorry, let me start over. It seems that a lot of these arguments almost seem to presuppose some sort of foundationalist theory of knowledge. And what I suppose someone could say is, okay, fine. What I'll just do is say, if you look at our sort of best explanation of the world, right? If you just look at, if we just start from, what we have, right? And we just go out and we investigate and we do whatever we can, the sort of coherent picture of the world that we're going to have, we can just have that and then just end up rejecting all of these sorts of intuitions, if that makes any sense.
Can you repeat that last part?
Right. So like, let's say we just have like, we just start, right? We're just there, right? And we have our senses and we have all of these sorts of intuitions and whatnot. And then we start investigating, right? We do, say, natural science, right? And we see that over and over and over again, the methods of natural science work, right? Mm-hmm. And what we could just say is, we sort of shift over our framework, right? And then we go to this new one that explains the whole world. And we just have all of this other stuff that's just not really doing any work. And we can just jettison that.
Well, that's what I would want to do. But there's a couple things. People are going to just insist that they don't think that they need to do work, or at least not work of the kind you think they're doing. And then others are just going to argue it is doing work. So, at least some even non-naturalist moral realists might appeal to the moral facts and say that they are doing a certain kind of work. Among other things, they might account for why we think some things are morally right or wrong, as arguments for moral convergence, that sort of thing.
Right. But then that would seem to me to be just sort of tractable to, I suppose, the methods of natural science, right? We could just sort of say, well, we can explain people's, although it's oftentimes not really clear what moral would amount to in a lot of cases, but that's this whole other rabbit hole. But it seems that we could just bring in like evolutionary considerations and, social norms and whatnot, and then just explain human moral behavior that way.
Yeah, it's possible though that the more rationalistic approaches to philosophy that emphasize more like a priori knowledge and that sort of thing might be that they're internally consistent, that they're not going to perceive their position as having any serious problems from an outside perspective. Any type of robustly empiricist perspective might seem like it's missing something critical from the point of view of someone with that point of view, especially pragmatists might just be many bridges too far. And I'm not sure I think that proponents of these views might be, in a certain sense, at least nearly or even in practice, just sort of functionally incorrigible. And that concerns me about positions like phenomenal conservatism. I mean, if you look at phenomenal conservatism, my biggest concern there isn't that an intuition provides some defeasible justification. It's that it seems to provide an unlimited amount of possible defeasible justification. Defeasible increasingly looks like it has an asterisk next to it. Okay, well, Humor on its blog some time ago, I've looked for the quote, I can't seem to find it. If someone can find it, please let me know and post it in the comments. But Humor said somewhere that he thinks that the probability of moral realism is like close to 99% or higher, like it's pretty much certain. And, cast the whole thing in Bayesian terms, cast phenomenal conservatism in Bayesian terms. And you do see, in other words, put it in terms of, assign a prior to it. What if my prior that realism is true is like 0.999999999999999. Okay, well now, and this is why I wrote that epistemic blank check blog post about this. And I talked about it in one of my videos, probably talked about it in half of my videos. But if your prior is that high, then people could present evidence. Like really, it could be that the philosophical literature consists only of really good arguments against your view, and you could say, "Yep, these are all good arguments," but it's not enough to overcome the prior. And you'll even see realists in a way that's like almost weirdly, like proudly sloganize this by saying, "Any arguments against moral realism are going to be less plausible than the intuition that it's true." Okay, well, that's a virtue. It's a virtue of your position that no matter how good our arguments are. But what's also strange about that is that they'll say any arguments against the position are less plausible than the position. How do they know that? They haven't encountered any argument against it. So that's a weirdly presumptuous claim. Like, I don't think I would ever go around. Like, so for instance, I endorse qualia quietism, and I tend to fall in the camp, people, you might call it I'm not a physicalist, but people call it a type A physicalism or illusionism or whatever. I'm in that vicinity of people. Here's how I would frame the position. I deny that there are qualia when qualia is construed in a robust form. So that's the camp that I fall into. Why I do so and how I differ from other people is not a drama. I deny that there are. Now, I don't think I would ever be tempted to say any argument in favor of qualia will be less plausible than the denial of their existence, because I don't think I have the sort of epistemic access to contrary perspectives that I could have under different counterfactual conditions. I don't. The same even applies to my anti-realism. I'm pretty confident that certain non-naturalist conceptions of realism are unintelligible, but it's certainly possible that I'm not thinking about things properly, or that I'm making some kind of serious conceptual error. And I wouldn't be so bold as to say any argument for moral realism will be less plausible than anti-realism. Maybe it would be. How do I know? But people say stuff like that, and they also seem to say it with a kind of weird glee. It's strange. They're like, they don't just say, "Oh yeah, it turns out that any argument against realism is less plausible than realism." They'll say it like a heady argument, like "Ha ha ha ha, gotcha." It's strange.
Right. That reminds me of something. I remember reading about this sort of like esoteric Nazism, and people would like make these wacky claims. Like one guy said he was in astral contact with Hitler, like Hitler survived World War II, and it's just, you can just imagine like I'm talking to Hitler. Like, can you prove it? No, I can't. I am talking to him, right? I just am talking to him. And you can sort of imagine this sort of person making this just absurd claim, right? But he's completely incorrigible. Like, you can't, I mean, there's just nothing you can say, because you can imagine that any argument against the fact that I'm in astral contact with Hitler is going to be less plausible than the position that, right. And like you said, a lot of this stuff might just be incorrigible. But as for humor specifically, I've read some of Humer's work, and Humer does, from what I remember, does take especially debunking arguments quite seriously. So evolutionary debunking arguments. I do remember reading some of his writings that took that concern quite seriously. But I can't speak as much to other people and how they use phenomenal conservatism, but I do understand the sort of concern that it's sort of like anything goes kind of thing. It can be used as a sort of anything goes kind of thing.
It can be, although I suspect and hope at least that Humer would see that as a misuse of the principle, not like a appropriate application, although maybe otherwise. I mean, if justification comes down to a private subjective matter, maybe anything goes. It really does. But, there would be a distinction between whether a person's justified and whether they're correct. And I at least am confident Humer would recognize that. So if someone, for whatever reason, was incorrigibly convinced that they were a tuna sandwich, I think we could all agree that they are probably not a tuna sandwich. So, I don't think Humer is necessarily going to have a problem with phenomenal conservatism. I do worry about other people using it, though, as a conversation stopper. For one thing, I don't particularly care if a person's justified in thinking something's true. I want to know whether it's true. If someone, I've given this example before, but if someone saw Bigfoot in the woods, okay, then they're justified in believing Bigfoot's real. But if they get into a philosophical dispute, they say, okay, well, I saw Bigfoot in the woods, so I'm justified in believing in Bigfoot. Okay, let's grant that that's true. And now what? Okay, so you're justified. And if you're going to say, it seems to me realism is true, so I'm justified in believing realism is true. Great. And I want to know why I should believe it. And I had thought the purpose of philosophy was for us to have discussions so we could all update our views towards the correct view, not for us to each be these individuals, islands of epistemic subjectivity where each one of us has special private access to to the truth. And there's no way of resolving that. And I think, Humer hopefully would just say, yeah, okay, that's just one component though. And then we look at all the other arguments. It's not like Humer goes, yeah, I'm satisfied with phenomenal conservatism. Realism seems true, so it is true. No defeaters, I'm good. Realism engages with the objections. Humer engages with the objections. Humer makes arguments. So Humer has a paper on moral convergence. So it doesn't stop with conservatism. But I do worry that dialectically other people might lift from phenomenal conservatism this sort of mega tool that one could just say, I'm justified, and then they don't have to do any of the other work from their own point of view. But yeah, it seems like a misuse.
Right. Yeah, it could definitely be biased because I do like Humer. He's quite generous. He's responded to a lot of my emails. But it seems that he does seem quite cognizant of objections to his sort of objections to realism. But like I said, I can't really speak to other people and how they might be using this principle. And, it's just, I suppose just to contrast it with the methods in, say, natural science, right? It doesn't seem like there's anything like this in natural science, where there's just this sort of in principle, interminable debate that you just can't resolve. And I don't want I don't want to, like I said, people might accuse me of scientism, but it seems fair to say that our gold standard of knowledge is the natural sciences. And if anything, I think that philosophers should be modeling a lot of what goes on in philosophy far more of what goes on in natural science. And like, it just, I don't know. I mean, do you know if there's anything like this sort of idea of like, I'm just convinced of my position, and, any argument you raise against this position is just not going to change my mind. Like, do you know of anything like that in natural science?
I don't think so. Yeah, it's going to just trade those kinds of philosophical problems, though, possibly for some other problems.
Right. Like if we were to say naturalize a lot of what's going on in philosophy, we just have other problems that we're.
Oh no, I just mean science science. It's not like a method. I see it as a amalgamation of different types of social practices that vary in overall quality, but ultimately have to be filtered through communities of people and institutions, and those will be replete with various sorts of problems that are distinctive in some cases and are more general in others. But I'm just trying to say, to say that as science yields uniquely valuable insight into what the world is like is not to say that it's like perfect and above reproach and doesn't have distinctive problems. That's the only thing.
Right. Definitely, I get that. And
you could say science better than philosophy, but they both are terrible. I don't know.
Right.
I don't really mean that, but
yeah.
You could say one is better than the other without one being perfect, I guess, which of course you weren't saying otherwise, but I'm just emphasizing that for the people that are worried about scientism.
Right. Of course. There's always this question of compared to what, right? So I guess we have to judge, be like sort of reasonable about the standards we're sort of setting. And I guess by human standards, something like physics, or I can't really attest too much to other fields, but that seems to me like by human standards, that's well, we don't have to really go into it, but
yeah, we don't. I think I'm going to wrap it up here. I think we've hopefully had a enjoyable conversation. I hope it was.
No, I definitely really enjoyed it, and
yeah, I've seen you around. I think you are normally saying something in the chat. I don't know. How did you find the channel?
Yeah, I really like it because you seem to point out a lot of the same concerns I have with like I used to, I sort of so actually it was you, because I used to be a realist of the non-naturalist kind, and I just watched some of your conversations, and you were just pointing out, wait, this stuff is just like nonsense. And I just thought to myself, wait, like over time, I just realized, wait a minute, this guy's right. There's just nothing here. And so I guess you sort of just like shook me out of that.
Cool. Okay.
I started realizing, wait, this is actually there in like a lot of philosophy, like the stuff where there's this sort of vague and sort of impenetrable discourse. So I really like the type of content you do. And I really like especially the meta philosophy stuff and the inquiry into philosophical methods.
Awesome. Well, all right. So I had a great time talking to you. I'm glad I'm able to start doing this more now, or at least more comfortable doing it. Would you like to come back on here? And if I bring more people on, would you want to talk to other people too? I don't want it to just be like us talking every week.
Oh yeah, weekly. Yeah. Yeah, sure. That sounds great.
Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. Hopefully people will see this example and then they'll want to come on here too, because there hasn't been a whole lot of people clamoring to get on here. But I'm gonna wrap it up there. I'm gonna go have dinner. I'm hungry, so I'm gonna get out of here. Thanks so much for being here. And I guess I'll say goodbye to everybody and I'll play the outro video. Is that all right with you? Anything,
right. That's great.
Any last things you want to say?
Yeah. Have a nice dinner.
All righty. Take care. All right. And let us get that. So anyway, check out if you're in here now and you weren't here before. So now I have a Discord that just started, I think yesterday. So go and join that. A link to it, I'll put it in the description, but it's also in my community posts. I also put a poll in the community posts. So go answer those polls. That's cool to get people talking there. Definitely like, subscribe, do all that stuff to get this, I want to get this channel going. I mentioned that I was at 400 and I just passed 400 subscribers. I think I got 3 or 4 while the stream is going. So there's been a few of you. So thank you for those of you that subscribed. If you don't want to, that's cool too, but I would appreciate it. And I guess I will see you all next week. And I also should say, I should be having some of that more content out soon. It's not just going to be weekend live streams. I'm going to be doing other sorts of stuff. And so I will get to all of that. And yeah, okay. Then I guess for now, I will say take care.